Thank you for choosing this video to fall asleep. Make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Story 1. The Hidden Forge of Eregion. The Hidden Forge of Eregion had been a myth whispered among the elves for centuries, a tale that few truly believed. Deep beneath the once glorious land of Eregion, a land where Celebrimba had crafted the finest rings of power, it was said that an ancient forge lay hidden, untouched by time yet tainted by the dark hand of Sauron himself. When the whispers began again, borne on the cold winds of the misty mountains, a group of elves, led by Calian, a skilled smith, and one of the last descendants of Eregion's finest artisans, set out to uncover its truth. What they found was beyond anything they had imagined. The journey to the forge was perilous. Eregion, now a desolate and scarred land after the wars that ravaged it, seemed to resist their every step. Ancient trees twisted in unnatural ways, and the very air felt thick with the weight of forgotten sorcery. Calian led his group through narrow passages, their feet guided by faint traces of ancient elvish runes that only a true smith could decipher. For days they travelled, descending deeper into the heart of the mountains, the glow of their torches barely holding back the shadows that pressed in on all sides. Finally they reached a vast stone door, engraved with symbols long forgotten, save for those who had studied the histories of Eregion. With a whispered incantation, the door groaned open, revealing a massive cavern. At its center stood the forge, its anvil dark and cold, yet exuding a presence that made the elves hesitate. The walls around the forge were lined with tools, long untouched but still sharp, as if waiting for their master's return. The very air hummed with a power that was both alluring and terrifying. Calian approached cautiously, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. His hand hovered over the anvil, hesitating before making contact. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a pulse of dark energy surged through him. His heart raced, and for a moment it was as if he could hear whispers from the shadows, faint but insistent, as though the forge itself was alive. The rest of the group, sensing the disturbance, drew their weapons, looking about nervously as the cavern seemed to darken. "This is not a place we should linger," whispered Iranian, Calian's closest friend and a warrior who had fought in the battles of the Second Age. "The air is heavy with evil." Calian nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the forge. "It is as I feared," he muttered. "This forge, it is no ordinary place. Celebrimba himself must have crafted it in his final days, perhaps under the influence of Sauron. The power that lingers here is twisted, but there is still great potential." A sudden clang echoed through the cavern, and Calian realized with a start that his own hand had grasped a hammer lying next to the anvil. It was as though the forge was calling to him, compelling him to create. The hammer felt warm in his grip, unnaturally so, as if it had never truly cooled. His mind raced, filled with visions of weapons and rings of unimaginable power, visions of bending the very elements to his will, of shaping the fate of Middle-earth with his own hands. Iranian placed a firm hand on his shoulder, breaking the trance. "We must leave, Calian. This place is cursed." But Calian could not tear himself away. "If we leave, others may find it," he argued, his voice distant, as though speaking from a dream. "Do you not see? This forge could give us the power to fight back against the darkness. We could craft weapons to rival the rings of power themselves. And at what cost? Iranian snapped, his voice harsh in the silence of the cavern. You can feel it, can't you? This place is tainted. Any who use this forge will be corrupted. We must destroy it. Before Callian could respond, a low rumble echoed from the walls, and the ground beneath them shook. The ancient stone door they had entered through began to close. Panic spread through the group, and they rushed toward the exit, but it was too late. The door slammed shut with a deafening boom, sealing them inside. The darkness deepened, and the forge's faint glow seemed to intensify, casting long, eerie shadows. The whispers that Callian had heard before grew louder, swirling around him. They promised power, dominion, mastery over the forces of the world. All he had to do was give in, to let the forge guide his hand. Iranian stood before him, sword drawn, his face grim. I will not let this place take you, Callian. You must fight it. Callian shook his head, the temptation almost unbearable. We cannot destroy it, Iranian. If we destroy it, we lose a chance to fight back. The forge is a tool, one we can control. You are a fool if you think you can control something that was made in the shadow of Sauron, Iranian growled, stepping closer. Do not let your pride be the end of you. In that moment, the ground split beneath them, a crack forming at the center of the forge. From its depths came a wave of heat, as though the fires that once fueled the creation of the rings of power had been reignited. The elves could feel it now, the sheer force of the malevolent power that dwelled beneath. The forge had awakened. Realizing the danger, Callian threw the hammer down and stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. You're right, Iranian, he gasped. We must destroy it. But how? Before Iranian could answer, a voice, not a whisper this time, but a clear, cold voice echoed from the darkness. You cannot destroy what was made to endure. The elves stood frozen, fear gripping their hearts as the presence of something ancient and malevolent loomed around them. The forge had been waiting for centuries, and now it had found new souls to bind to its dark purpose. Story 2. The Betrayal of Celebrimbor. Celebrimbor, the grandson of Fëanor and heir to one of the greatest legacies in all of Elvendom, was known for his unmatched skill in the craft of smithing. His works had been revered across Middle-earth, but as his renown grew, so too did his obsession with perfecting his craft. The rings of power became his ultimate ambition, the singular goal that consumed his every waking thought. But where once his friends and allies had celebrated his brilliance, now they watched with growing unease, for the deeper he delved into his work, the more distant and secretive he became. At first, the elves of a region marveled at the beauty of the rings that Celebrimbor and his guild, the Gwaithai Myrdain, crafted. Each ring was a work of wonder, a fusion of elvish craftsmanship and the mysterious knowledge that had been imparted to them by an Atar, the fair and wise stranger who had come to their city offering his knowledge of ring lore. Anatar had won Celebrimbor's trust with his deep understanding of the art of creation, but not all of the elves shared Celebrimbor's unwavering trust in the newcomer. Whispers began to spread in the halls of Ostin Edhill, whispers of doubt and suspicion. Anatar's gifts come with a price, whispered Arendir, one of Celebrimbor's oldest friends and advisors. He, along with a few others, had begun to question the wisdom of Celebrimber's alliance with the mysterious figure. We know little of him, yet Celebrimber places all his faith in his knowledge. Is it truly wise to trust so blindly? Others, like Lariel, an elf who had fought alongside Celebrimber during the wars of Beleriand, shared Arendir's concerns. It is as though the shadows of the First Age follow him, she confided to Arendir. He speaks less of the future and more of power to shape the world, to control it. This is not the Celebrimber I knew. His mind is clouded. For a time they kept their concerns to themselves, unwilling to confront their lord directly. But as Celebrimber became more withdrawn, spending long days and nights in the forges with Anatar, crafting in secret, the unease among his allies grew. What had once been an open and collaborative project had now become something closed off, shrouded in secrecy. The other smiths were no longer allowed to see the designs for the latest rings. Even Arendir, who had been by Celebrimber's side for centuries, was kept in the dark. One evening, as the fires of the forge flickered and the city of Ost-in-Needhill lay quiet beneath the stars, Arendir could bear it no longer. He sought out Celebrimber in his private workshop, where he knew the elf lord would be working alongside Anatar. As he approached the hidden chamber, Arendir felt a chill in the air, an unnatural cold that seemed to seep from the very stone of the walls. His heart quickened, and he could hear faint voices, Anatar's voice, smooth and persuasive, and Celebrimber's, quieter but full of determination. Arendir pushed open the heavy door, stepping inside to find Celebrimber hunched over an anvil, a gleaming ring in his hands. Anatar stood nearby, watching with an approving smile. At that moment Celebrimber looked up, his eyes gleaming with a fervor Arendir had never seen before. It was not the gaze of the friend he had known for centuries, it was the gaze of someone consumed by something far darker. Arendir, Celebrimber said, his voice carrying an edge of irritation, "Why do you intrude upon my work?" "You've become a stranger to us, Celebrimber," Arendir said, stepping forward. "We used to craft together, create together, yet now you hide in shadows, speaking only to this. Anatar, can you not see what he is doing to you?" Celebrimber stood, his face tightening with frustration. "Anatar has given us the knowledge to create wonders, Arendir. Wonders that will protect our people, preserve the beauty of Middle-earth. You would deny us that?" "It is not Anatar's knowledge that I fear," Arendir replied, his voice rising. "It is the darkness that comes with it. The more you craft, the more you fall under his influence. You are no longer the master of your own will." Anatar's voice, smooth and calm, cut through the tension. "I offer only wisdom, Arendir. Celebrimber has the vision to see what the rings can do. It is fear that blinds you." Arendir turned on him, eyes blazing. "And what do you gain from this? Why are you so eager to see these rings completed?" "Enough!" Celebrimber shouted, silencing both of them. "Anatar has done nothing but help us. You, Arendir, have lost your faith in me. If you cannot see the importance of what we are doing, then you no longer belong here." The words struck Arendir like a blow. His heart sank, but he knew then that his friend was lost. With one last glance at the ring gleaming in Celebrimber's hands, he turned and left the chamber, his steps heavy with sorrow. Outside, Arendir found Lariel waiting. The look on his face told her all she needed to know. "He will not listen," Arondir said softly. "He is lost in Anatar's web." Lariel nodded grimly. "Then we must do what we can to protect the others. If Celebrimber will not heed reason, we must stop him." The plan they devised was born out of desperation. Arondir, Lariel, and a handful of other elves loyal to a region but distrustful of Anatar would steal the ring Celebrimber had crafted and hide them. They knew it was treason, but they believed it was the only way to save their people from the growing shadow they could all feel creeping over the land. One fateful night they entered the forges, hoping to seize the rings while Celebrimber slept, but he was waiting for them. His eyes burned with a fury none of them had ever seen, and in his hand he held a newly forged ring, glowing with a strange dark light. "You would betray me." Celebrimber's voice was low, filled with bitter rage. "After all I have done, you would steal from me." "It is not betrayal, Celebrimber," Arondir said, stepping forward. "It is salvation. You are blinded by your ambition, by the lies Anatar has fed you." But Celebrimber would not hear it. With a cry of anger, he raised the ring and called upon the power Anatar had taught him to wield. The forge erupted in flames, and the battle that followed was swift and brutal. Arondir and his allies fought valiantly, but they were no match for the power of the ring Celebrimber had crafted in his madness. As the flames died down, the forge lay in ruins. Arondir and the others lay slain, their bodies strewn across the floor, and Celebrimber, the last lord of Eregion, stood alone, his heart filled with the bitter taste of betrayal. But in the silence that followed, as the heat from the forge cooled, Celebrimber felt a terrible realization settle upon him. He had not only lost his friends, he had lost himself. Story 3. The Shadow of Kzad Dum. The great halls of Kzad Dum echoed with the sounds of industry. Hammers struck anvils, the clatter of picks against stone reverberated through the mines, and the proud songs of the dwarves filled the vast chambers. Deep beneath the misty mountains, Kzad Dum was a city of marvels, the grandest of all dwarven realms. Its wealth in mithril, a metal of unmatched strength and beauty, had long attracted miners and smiths alike. But even as they dug deeper into the mountain's veins, the dwarves of Kzad Dum were unaware of the ancient evil that slumbered far beneath their feet, waiting for the day it would be awakened. Durin I, the current king, sat upon his throne, overseeing the expansion of his city. He was a ruler of great wisdom and strength, but even his eyes, sharp as they were, failed to see the dark omens that had begun to manifest deep in the mines. As his miners dug ever deeper in search of more mithril, strange accidents started to occur. Tunnels collapsed for no apparent reason. Veteran miners complained of an oppressive weight in the air, and some spoke in hushed voices of shadows moving in the darkness where no light should reach. Among the miners was Thrain, a respected foreman and a descendant of the line of Durin. He had spent his life in the mines of Kzad Dum, but in recent months, even he had begun to feel an inexplicable unease. There were places in the deepest tunnels that the dwarves had long avoided, out of respect for old tales and warnings passed down through generations. But with the demand for mithril growing and the veins running thinner, they had no choice but to push into these forbidden depths. Thrain had led his team into one such tunnel, where the rock was harder and colder than anything they had encountered before. There was an unnatural chill in the air, and the flickering flames of their torches seemed to barely hold back the pressing shadows. As they delved deeper, they uncovered strange, ancient carvings on the walls, runes that none of the dwarves could decipher. They looked old, far older than the dwarven settlements, and seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. "We should stop here," said Dwalin, one of Thrain's closest companions, his voice low with dread. "There's something wrong with this place." Thrain hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to heed Dwalin's words. But the pressure to produce more mithril was great, and his pride as a foreman would not allow him to turn back without results. "We press on," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "The mithril is close, I can feel it." The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe, and the stones seemed to groan around them. It was as if the mountain itself protested their intrusion. Suddenly there was a loud crack, and the tunnel floor collapsed beneath their feet. Thrain and his men tumbled into a vast cavern, deeper than any they had yet explored. When they recovered from the fall, they found themselves in a chamber unlike any they had ever seen. The walls were lined with strange blackened stone, and in the center of the room stood a massive, ancient door, sealed with runes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The air was heavy with a sense of dread, and none of the dwarves dared approach the door. "What is this place?" whispered Dwalin, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Thrain replied, his voice trembling, "but we've gone too far. We need to leave." But even as they turned to go, a low rumbling filled the chamber, and the sealed door began to creak open, the ancient runes glowing brighter as if awakened by their presence. A cold wind rushed out from the darkness beyond, carrying with it a foul stench and the unmistakable sense of something ancient and malevolent. Panic seized the dwarves. They scrambled to climb back up the collapsed tunnel, but the walls were too steep and crumbled beneath their hands. Thrain felt the terror growing within him as the rumbling grew louder. He turned back toward the door, and what he saw froze his blood. From the blackness beyond the door, a massive shadow moved, too large and terrible to be anything natural. It slithered and shifted, its form indistinct yet terrifying. The very air around it seemed to darken as it advanced. Thrain had heard tales of such things in ancient dwarven lore, whispers of creatures that should never be awakened, of nameless terrors that slept beneath the earth, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of the being that now emerged from the darkness. "Run!" Thrain shouted, his voice cracking with fear, but there was nowhere to run. The shadow filled the chamber, its presence suffocating. One by one, the dwarfs fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the weight of its malice. Thrain tried to rise to fight back, but it was as if his limbs were made of lead. The shadow loomed over him, and he could feel its cold, hollow gaze upon him, as though it were appraising his very soul. Then, with a sound like the wailing of the damned, the shadow surged forward. Thrain's world exploded in darkness, and he knew no more. Back in the halls of Kzad Dum, Durin I was growing increasingly concerned. It had been days since Thrain and his team had returned from the lower mines, and no word had come from them. He sent scouts to investigate, but they found only the collapsed tunnel, too deep and dangerous to excavate quickly. Rumors began to spread among the dwarves, rumors of something stirring in the deep places of the world, something that had lain dormant for an age. In the days that followed, strange occurrences plagued Kzad Dum. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and an unnatural cold seeped through the lower halls. The dwarves, proud and unyielding as they were, began to feel a fear they had not known in centuries. The forges grew cold, and even the mithril, once their greatest prize, seemed tainted by a lingering darkness. Durin I could no longer ignore the signs. He called his council together, and they made the decision to seal the deepest mines. But it was too late. The shadow that had been awakened beneath Kzad Dum was no longer content to remain in the dark. It moved now, slowly but surely, toward the heart of the dwarven kingdom. The dwarves of Kzad Dum had dug too deep, and in doing so they had unleashed an ancient evil. And though they did not yet know it, the shadow they had awoken would one day come to be known by a name that would strike fear into the hearts of all who heard it. Durin's bane. Story 4. The Orcs' Secret Rebellion. Deep in the shadowed lands of Mordor, beneath the ever-watchful eye of Sauron, a restlessness began to stir among the ranks of the Orcs. For centuries they had been the foot soldiers of darkness, slaves to Sauron's will, bred for war, and forced into servitude. But even among the Orcs, who had long since been twisted by dark magic and cruelty, there were those who grew weary of their existence. The lash of their masters, the unending wars, and the endless march toward death with no reward began to weigh heavily on them. Among these Orcs, a quiet rebellion started to form, a dangerous whisper of defiance against the Dark Lord himself. It began with a single Orc, a veteran of countless battles, known among his kin as Grishnak. He had fought in the War of the Last Alliance, survived the dark years when Sauron lay dormant, and now served in the armies preparing for another assault on the lands of men and elves. Grishnak had seen more death than he cared to remember, and though he was as brutal as any of his kind, a seed of doubt had taken root in his heart. He had begun to question the purpose of their endless war. What did they, the Orcs, truly gain from Sauron's reign of terror? Grishnak voiced these doubts cautiously at first, speaking only to a few trusted comrades during the long, cold nights in the barracks. "What has the Dark Lord given us?" he would whisper. "What have we to show for all our blood and sweat? No gold, no land, no glory. Only the crack of the whip and the certainty of death." Others listened, though fear kept most of them silent. Sauron's dominion over them was absolute, and any sign of rebellion was met with swift and merciless punishment. The Orcs had been bred to obey, to serve without question. But Grishnak's words struck a chord with some, especially the older Orcs who had lived through countless campaigns and had begun to feel the weight of their thankless existence. One night, Grishnak gathered a small group of like-minded Orcs in the depths of the fortress of Barad-dûr, far from the prying eyes of Sauron's overseers. There, in the shadows of the towering black walls, they spoke freely of their hatred for their master. "There are more of us than there are of the Nazgûl," growled Uzag, a hulking brute who had served as one of Sauron's personal bodyguards. His voice was low but filled with anger. "If we strike together, we could end him." "End him?" snarled another orc named Gorlash, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "He's no mere An or elf. He's a dark power. How do you kill a being like that?" Grushnok, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. His eyes burned with a cold determination. "We don't need to kill him outright. We weaken his hold, strike at his power. Without his orc armies, Sauron would be crippled. He relies on us more than he would ever admit. If we rise up, refuse to fight, refuse to serve, it would shake the foundations of his rule." The idea was as dangerous as it was radical. For centuries the orcs had been seen as mindless brutes, creatures incapable of organizing beyond what Sauron or his lieutenants commanded. But Grushnok had seen firsthand the power of rebellion, even in the most hopeless of places. He had fought against men and elves, and while he hated them with every fiber of his being, he couldn't deny that their strength came from unity and the belief in something greater than themselves. If orcs could find that same unity, that same belief in their own freedom, perhaps they too could overthrow their tyrant. The rebellion began in secret, spreading slowly through the ranks of Mordor's legions. Grushnok and his followers worked carefully, knowing that Sauron's spies were everywhere. They spoke only in whispers, using old Orcish battle codes to send messages and recruit more to their cause. They sabotaged supply lines, disrupted the forges, and caused minor accidents that slowed the production of weapons. Small acts of defiance, enough to frustrate Sauron's plans, but not enough to draw the full wrath of his Nazgul. But as the rebellion grew, so did the risk. Grushnok knew that if Sauron discovered their plans, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for the orcs involved, but for all of Middle-earth. For if Sauron's orcs rebelled and his armies crumbled, he would surely unleash his full fury on the world, using dark magic and his more loyal servants to exact revenge. The delicate balance of power could tip, and in his rage Sauron might bring about the ruin of all, not just the orcs, but men, elves, and dwarves as well. As the orcs plotted, a deeper question lingered in the minds of Grushnok's followers. If they succeeded in overthrowing Sauron, what then? Could they truly forge a new life for themselves, free from the tyranny of dark lords and endless war? Or were they too far gone, too corrupted by centuries of violence and hatred to ever live in peace? Grushnok did not have the answers. He knew only that they had to try, for the alternative, endless servitude under Sauron's cruel hand was no longer acceptable. They could not continue living as pawns in a game of power that only served their master's ambitions. The rebellion reached its tipping point when one of Grushnok's closest allies, an orc named Redug, was captured by Sauron's lieutenants and tortured for information. Redug, loyal to the end, refused to betray the rebellion, but his capture sent shockwaves through the ranks. The orcs knew that Sauron would soon discover the full extent of their plot, and the time for subtle sabotage had passed. It was now or never. Grushnok rallied his forces, gathering every orc who had sworn allegiance to the rebellion. In the dead of night they launched their assault on Barad-dûr, striking with a ferocity born of desperation. The fortress erupted into chaos as orc fought orc, and for a brief moment it seemed as though they might succeed. But the eye of Sauron was ever watchful, and as the first rays of dawn crept over the mountains, the full wrath of the Dark Lord descended upon them. The rebellion was crushed, its leaders slain, and the survivors dragged back to the forges in chains. Grushnach, bloodied and broken, was brought before the Dark Lord himself. Sauron's voice echoed through the chamber, cold and cruel. "Did you truly believe you could defy me?" Grushnach, defiant to the end, spat at the feet of his master. "We are not slaves. We are not your tools." Sauron laughed a deep, terrible sound. "You are whatever I make you." With a flick of his will, Sauron snuffed out the rebellion, and the shadow of his dominion grew even darker. The orcs had dared to dream of freedom, but in the end, they remained bound to the darkness, their rebellion a brief, futile flicker in the vast, unyielding shadow of Sauron's power. And yet, even in defeat, the seeds of defiance had been planted. One day, Grushnach's rebellion might be remembered, not as a failure, but as the first spark of something far greater, a spark that would one day ignite the fires of freedom across all of Middle-earth. Story 5. The Ringwraith's Rise. Long before he became a wraith, Ahorahil was a powerful king of men. His kingdom stretched across the fertile plains of Run, where his people prospered under his rule. Ahorahil was a wise and just ruler, respected by his subjects and feared by his enemies. But for all his wealth and power, he hungered for more. His ambitions were boundless, and he desired to leave a legacy that would outlast the lives of men, a kingdom that would endure through the ages. It was this ambition that Sauron, the Dark Lord, preyed upon when he came to Ahorahil in disguise, offering him a gift that would seal his fate. Sauron appeared before the king as Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, a figure of great beauty and wisdom, bearing a ring of power, crafted in secret. He promised Ahorahil dominion over men, immortality, and knowledge beyond mortal comprehension. All the king had to do was accept the ring and the power that came with it. For a moment Ahorahil hesitated. He was a man of great pride, but the thought of eternal life, of being a ruler untouched by time or death, was too tempting. In his heart he knew there would be a price, but ambition clouded his judgment. With a firm grip, Ahorahil accepted the ring. At first the effects were subtle. The ring was beautiful, its craftsmanship unparalleled. Ahorahil could feel its power the moment he slipped it onto his finger. A strange warmth that filled him, making his senses sharper, his strength greater. He felt as though he could command the very elements. His advisors noticed the change, whispering that their king seemed stronger, more vigorous, but none dared question him. His rule, already strong, grew more absolute. Rivals who had once contested his authority now bent the knee without a fight, and Ahorahil began to believe that the ring truly was a gift, one without consequences. For years Ahorahil ruled with the ring, and in that time his kingdom flourished. He led his armies to victories on distant battlefields, expanded his realm, and amassed great wealth. But as time passed, the subtle influence of the ring began to take hold. The power that once seemed so pure and boundless began to twist his thoughts. He became suspicious of those around him, fearing betrayal where none existed. He isolated himself, trusting only in the power of the ring. The more he wore it, the more it seemed to whisper to him in the quiet of the night, filling his mind with dark promises. The people of his kingdom grew uneasy. Their king, once beloved, had become distant and cold, his face drawn and pale, as though a shadow hung over him. The more he used the ring, the less human he seemed. His eyes, once bright with life, now gleamed with an unnatural light. Rumors began to spread that Akoriel had made a pact with dark forces, that the ring he wore was not a gift from the gods, but a curse from the depths of Mordor. Yet none dared challenge him, for the king's power had grown too great. His armies were loyal, and his enemies trembled at the mention of his name. Akoriel, too, began to feel the toll of the ring. His body, once strong and vital, felt different, as though it no longer fully belonged to him. He could no longer feel hunger or thirst, no longer knew the need for sleep. It was as though the world of men was slipping away from him, leaving only the cold, empty power of the ring in its place. The whispers grew louder, telling him that his time as a king of men was over, that he was destined for something greater, something eternal. In his heart he knew that the ring was drawing him into darkness, but by then it was too late. The ring had become part of him, its influence too strong to resist. The moment of his full transformation came when Sauron called the 9 kings to him. Akoriel journeyed to Mordor, along with the other men who had accepted the rings, each one now a shadow of the king they had once been. In the shadow of Mount Doom, Sauron revealed his true nature to them, casting off the guise of Anatar. The kings, once mighty, now knelt before the Dark Lord, bound to his will through the power of the One Ring. Akoriel felt his humanity slipping away as the full weight of the ring's power consumed him. His flesh seemed to melt into shadow, his body becoming less substantial with every passing moment. Sauron's voice filled his mind, commanding him to serve, and Akoriel could do nothing but obey. He had thought himself powerful, but in that moment he realized that he was merely a pawn in Sauron's great plan. The gift of immortality had been a lie. He would live forever, yes, but as a wraith, a servant bound to the will of the Dark Lord, existing only in the shadows, neither alive nor dead. Akoriel, the once great king of Run, was no more. In his place stood a ring wraith, one of the 9, stripped of his name and his past. He no longer cared for his kingdom or his people. His only thought was of Sauron's command, his only desire to serve the One Ring. The other wraiths were the same, bound together in their eternal servitude, their fates sealed by their own greed and ambition. For centuries, Akoriel served as one of Sauron's most trusted lieutenants, spreading fear and destruction across Middle-earth. He led armies of orcs and men in the Dark Lord's name, hunting down those who opposed Sauron's rule. The ring that had once promised him eternal life and power had instead made him a slave to darkness. He could no longer remember the face of his wife, the sound of his children's laughter, or the warmth of the sun on his skin. All that remained was the cold, empty hunger of the ringwraith, a hollow echo of the man he had once been. As the years passed, Akoriel became a shadow of terror, a nameless wraith feared by all who encountered him. The men of Middle-earth would never know his true name, for he was no longer Horahel, king of men. He was simply one of the Nazgul, the servant of Sauron, bound forever to the will of the Dark Lord and the power of the One Ring. And in the darkness he served without end, a creature of shadow, longing for power but trapped in eternal servitude, forever lost to the evil that had claimed him. Story 6. The Last March of the Entwives. For centuries the Entwives were thought to be lost, a fading memory in the minds of the Ents of Fangorn Forest. Treebeard, the eldest of the Ents, would speak of them with sorrow, remembering their departure from the deep woods to the rolling farmlands they loved so much. Unlike the Ents who cherished the wild forests, the Entwives had longed for order and cultivation. They wandered south, away from Fangorn, and as the wars of Middle-earth raged on, they were lost. No one knew what became of them, and many believed they had perished, victims of the destruction that had swept across the land. But they were not gone. Far in the southern lands, beyond the borders of Mordor and Gondor, a small group of Entwives had survived. For centuries they had hidden themselves in the lush, fertile plains, tending to their gardens and keeping to the ancient ways of their kind. They had stayed away from the conflicts of men, elves and orcs, their only desire to nurture the earth and live in peace. Yet the world outside was changing, and the dark forces that had long plagued Middle-earth were growing stronger. Rumors of their existence had reached the ears of Sauron's servants, and now the Entwives found themselves hunted. At the heart of their hidden grove, Nellis, the leader of the surviving Entwives, stood tall and solemn, her bark like skin, etched with the wisdom of ages. She had sensed the growing darkness for some time now, a creeping shadow that seemed to reach even the most remote corners of the world. Her sisters too felt the unease in the air. Their trees no longer grew as freely, and the soil had become colder, less nourishing. The peace they had known for so long was ending. "We cannot stay hidden much longer," Nellis said, her voice deep and resonant, like the rustling of leaves in a strong wind. The other Entwives gathered around her, their eyes wide with fear and concern. They had long feared this day, but the time had come for them to act. "The enemy knows of us. We must march." The Entwives were not warriors like the Ents of Fangorn, but they were no less formidable. Their strength lay in their deep connection to the earth, in their ability to nurture and shape the land. Yet they knew they could not stand idly by while the forces of Mordor closed in on them. Nellis, though old and wise, had seen what the enemy could do to forests and gardens alike. If they did not fight, their kind would be wiped from existence forever. "We should flee further south," said Fimbrethel, the youngest of the Entwives, her voice trembling. "We are not warriors. We cannot stand against the darkness." Nellis shook her head, her branches creaking. "There is no place left to run. If we flee, they will only follow. We must stand our ground and protect what remains of our gardens. If we do not, there will be nothing left for us or the earth." Though fear rippled through the Entwives, Nellis' words held truth. They had hidden for so long, always believing that distance could protect them. But the world was smaller now, and darkness crept into even the most isolated places. With heavy hearts, they began to prepare for their march, a journey they had hoped they would never need to take. As they moved through the southern lands, the ground trembled beneath their roots. The trees, long tended by the Entwives, stirred with life, their branches swaying in sorrowful farewell. The Entwives marched in silence, their forms towering and graceful, like ancient spirits of the earth itself. Wherever they walked, the land seemed to respond. Flowers bloomed in their wake, and the trees whispered their lament. They knew that this march could be their last, that their survival was not guaranteed, but they marched with dignity and purpose. Word of their movements soon reached the enemy. Orcs and creatures far fouler were dispatched from the far corners of Mordor to hunt them down. These dark forces had no respect for the beauty or life that the Entwives cherished. They sought only destruction, and under the command of their unseen masters, they were relentless. The Entwives, though few in number, stood tall as they faced the coming onslaught. The first attack came under the cover of night. The dark creatures swarmed from the shadows, their eyes gleaming with malice as they sought to tear the Entwives from the earth. Nellis, with a deep connection to the land, called upon the trees and the plants around them. Roots erupted from the ground, ensnaring the orcs and crushing them with the weight of centuries. Branches lashed out, sweeping the attackers aside, but still more came. For days the battle raged. The Entwives fought with all their might, but they were not warriors. Their power was in creation, not destruction. And though they held their ground, they knew it was only a matter of time before the dark forces overwhelmed them. One by one the Entwives began to fall. Fimbrithil was the first, her body shattered beneath the weight of countless orcs. Others followed, their forms breaking as they fought to protect the land they loved. Nella stood at the center of the grove, the last of the Entwives, her bark scarred and cracked, her roots embedded deep into the earth. She could feel the life force of her sisters fading, their connection to the world slipping away, but she would not give up. With the last of her strength, she called upon the ancient power of the earth itself, a force older than the darkness that hunted them. The ground beneath her trembled, and the trees around her surged with energy, their branches entwining into an impenetrable wall. The dark forces recoiled, momentarily halted by the sudden surge of power, but Nellis knew it would not last. She could feel her strength waning, her body beginning to splinter. Yet in those final moments she felt a deep sense of peace. The Entwives had fought not for power or dominion, but for the earth itself, for the beauty of life that they had cherished for so long. As she looked upon the grove one last time, she whispered a prayer to the trees, to the flowers, to the land she had nurtured. And then she fell, the last of the Entwives. When the dark forces finally broke through the grove, there was nothing left but silence. The Entwives were gone. Their last march ended. But the land they had fought to protect remained untouched, the living testament to their sacrifice. The dark forces, frustrated by their inability to destroy the grove, retreated, leaving the southern lands in peace, at least for a time. The memory of the Entwives faded once more into legend, but the beauty of their final stand lingered in the earth they had cherished. And though they were gone, their spirit remained woven into the very fabric of Middle-earth, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there are those who will fight for life and beauty until the very end. Story 7. The Fall of Numa. In the final days of Numenor, the once great island kingdom teetered on the brink of ruin. Its towering white cities, its mighty ships, and its proud people had once been the envy of the world. But under the rule of King Ar-Pharazôn, Numenor had fallen into darkness. The arrogance of the king had led him to defy the valor and challenge the very laws of the world. Goaded by the whispers of Sauron, who now sat as the king's most trusted counselor, the island was racked with strife, torn between those who still followed the old ways and the growing number who had turned to the worship of Morgoth, seduced by Sauron's lies. It was in this time of fear and chaos that Elendor, a young sailor, found himself caught in the storm of Numenor's downfall. Elendor had spent most of his life at sea, like many of the Numenorians. The sea had always been their friend, a vast, untamable force that had brought them wealth and knowledge. But in recent years, even the sea had seemed to grow restless. Strange storms brewed in the distance, and the tides no longer moved as they once did. Rumors of terrible events spread through the harbour's whispers of doom, of the Valar's wrath, of an inevitable end. And as the king prepared for his final, blasphemous assault on the Blessed Realm, Numenor itself began to tear apart from within. Elendor had never cared much for politics. His family was one of the faithful, those who still held to the teachings of the Valar and the old ways, but he kept his head down, more concerned with providing for his mother and sister than with the growing tensions in the city of Armenelos. Yet, as the streets filled with the king's soldiers and Sauron's priests, it became clear that the conflict was no longer something he could avoid. The day the king announced his plan to sail west and claim immortality by force, Elendor knew the time had come to act. His sister Elariel had been outspoken against the king's growing tyranny, and rumors had reached him that those who opposed the king openly were being arrested, their fates unknown. The faithful were being rounded up, accused of treason, and many had already disappeared in the dead of night. Elendor feared for his family, knowing that they would not be spared from the wrath of the king's men. That evening, after returning from the docks, Elendor found his mother waiting for him, her face pale with fear. "The soldiers have come for your sister," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They took her while you were away. I don't know where they've gone." Elendor's heart sank. Elariel had always been defiant, her spirit as untamable as the seas he sailed, but now her courage had put her in mortal danger. He knew that if she had been taken by the king's men, it was only a matter of time before she was imprisoned or worse. Without a moment's hesitation, he gathered what supplies he could and set out into the dark streets of Armenelos, his mind racing with thoughts of how to find and save her. The city was no longer the gleaming capital of old. Darkness hung over the streets, and the people moved like shadows, fearful of drawing attention to themselves. Sauron's influence had transformed Numenor into a land of fear and suspicion, where brother could no longer trust brother. Elendor kept his head low, avoiding the patrols of soldiers as he made his way toward the central district where the king's prisons were located. As he neared the fortress, a hand grabbed his shoulder, pulling him into an alley. Elendor spun, ready to fight, but stopped when he saw the face of his old friend Haleth, another sailor from his crew. Haleth's face was grim, his eyes filled with the same fear that had been growing in everyone since Sauron's rise to power. "You're looking for your sister, aren't you?" Haleth said in a low voice. Elendor nodded, his pulse quickening. "Do you know where she is?" Haleth glanced around nervously before nodding. "They took her to the old temple. It's where they're holding the faithful before they do what they do." Elendor's blood ran cold. The temple Haleth spoke of had once been a place of peace and worship, but under Sauron's influence, it had become something far darker. Sacrifices were rumored to take place there now, offerings to Morgoth, and the faithful who were taken there rarely returned. Time was running out. Without another word, Elendor made his way to the temple, his heart pounding in his chest. He moved quickly, the weight of his sister's fate heavy on his shoulders. As he approached the dark, towering structure, he saw the flickering lights of torches and heard the low murmurs of chanting from within. His stomach turned, but he forced himself to press on. Sneaking around the side of the temple, Elendor found a narrow entrance, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and incense, and the chanting grew louder, filling the halls with a terrible sound. He crept through the shadows, his heart hammering, until he reached a chamber at the heart of the temple. There, bound and kneeling on the cold stone floor, was Alarielle. Her hands were tied, and her head hung low, but she was alive. 2 guards stood nearby, watching her, oblivious to Elendor's presence. Without hesitation, he drew the small knife he had brought with him and moved swiftly. He took the first guard down silently, his blade sinking into the man's throat before he could cry out. The second guard turned just in time to meet Elendor's fist crumpling to the ground with a grunt. Elendor rushed to his sister's side, cutting her bonds. "We have to go," he whispered urgently. Alarielle looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. "They know about us, Elendor. We can't stay here." "I know," he said, pulling her to her feet. "We'll get Mother and leave. The Valar will protect us." But even as they fled the temple, Elendor knew that Numenor was doomed. The land itself seemed to tremble beneath their feet, and in the distance, a great storm gathered over the western horizon. Sauron's influence had poisoned the heart of Numenor, and the king's defiance of the Valar had sealed their fate. As they fled through the streets, Elendor looked back one last time at the towering palace of Armenalos, where King Ar-Pharazôn plotted his final assault on the Blessed Realm. The end was near, and there was no saving Numenor now. All that remained was to save those he loved from the destruction that would surely come. Story 8. The Elves' Final Stand. The elven stronghold of Kalenion had long been a symbol of defiance, its white towers rising above the forests of Erin Galen, gleaming with a light that seemed to defy the encroaching darkness of Sauron's dominion. For centuries it had stood as a bastion of hope for the free peoples of Middle-earth, a place where the light of the Eldar still shone bright. But now that light was dimming. Sauron's armies, vast and relentless, had marched north from Mordor, and they had laid siege to Kalenion, surrounding it with a sea of orcs, trolls, and darker creatures of shadow. Inside the stronghold, the defenders prepared for what might be their final battle. Eladrin, the captain of the Elven Guard, stood upon the battlements, his keen eyes scanning the enemy lines that stretched to the horizon. Fires flickered in the distance, casting a sickly glow over the landscape. The once beautiful forest, home to his people for generations, had been ravaged by Sauron's forces. Trees ancient and wise had been felled, their broken forms now littering the ground like the bodies of fallen warriors. The enemy was preparing to strike, and Eladrin knew that when they did, it would be with the full force of Sauron's malice. Behind him, in the courtyard of the fortress, the elves moved with quiet efficiency, preparing for the inevitable assault. Their faces were calm, but their eyes betrayed the weight of their grim situation. They were warriors skilled and proud, but they were few in number. Sauron's forces, on the other hand, seemed limitless. For every orc that fell, 2 more appeared to take its place, and now, after weeks of siege, their supplies were dwindling. The elves could not hold out forever. Eldrin's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Lady Arian, the ruler of Kalenian, approaching. Her golden hair flowed behind her like a river of light, but her face was shadowed with concern. She had led her people through many hardships, but now the burden of leadership weighed heavily upon her. "Eldrin," she said softly, her voice carrying the melody of ages, "the council has met. We must decide our course." He nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. For days the question had loomed over them all. Should they stay and fight, risking everything for the chance to hold Kalenian, or should they abandon the stronghold and flee into exile, leaving their ancestral home to the darkness? "I know what the others will say," Eldrin said, his voice tense. "Some will wish to stay and defend our home to the last, to die with honor if need be. Others will argue that fleeing is our only hope for survival, that we must preserve our people, even if it means abandoning what we hold dear." "And you, Eldrin?" Arian asked, her gaze steady. "What do you believe?" He hesitated, torn between his duty as a captain and the love he held for his people. "I do not fear death," he said at last, "but I fear what will happen if we leave. If we flee, the darkness will claim this land, and it will spread further, unchecked. But if we stay, we may not survive." Arian looked out over the battlements, her eyes scanning the enemy forces as they gathered for the next assault. "There is truth in both paths," she said. "To stay would be to honor our ancestors, to defend what they built with their blood and toil. But to flee would be to preserve the future of our people, to ensure that the light of the Eldar does not fade entirely from this world." She turned back to him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I do not know what the right choice is, Eldrin, and yet I must decide." Before either of them could speak further, a horn sounded from the enemy camp. The orc armies were stirring, their ranks moving with renewed purpose. Siege engines rumbled forward, and great war drums began to beat, filling the air with a deep, ominous rhythm. The assault was beginning. Eldrin drew his sword, its elven steel gleaming in the dim light. "There is no more time," he said, his voice hardening. "The enemy comes, we must fight." Arian nodded, though her face remained troubled. "Go, Eldrin, rally the warriors. I will speak to the council one last time." With a bow, Eldrin turned and descended the stairs, his mind focused on the battle to come. As he moved through the courtyard, he called to the warriors, rallying them to the walls. Bows were strung, arrows notched, and swords drawn. The elves, though few, stood ready, their faces resolute. They had fought many battles before, and they would fight this one with the same courage and skill. The first wave of orcs crashed against the walls like a dark tide. Ladders were raised, and grappling hooks flew through the air, clinging to the stone battlements. The elves met them with swift precision, cutting down the invaders before they could gain a foothold. Arrows flew, striking true, and the clash of steel echoed through the fortress. But the enemy was relentless, and for every orc that fell, another took its place. Siege towers, lumbering and massive, rolled forward, their spiked wheels grinding into the earth as they advanced. Eldrin fought alongside his warriors, his sword a blur of motion as he struck down orc after orc. His heart pounded with the rhythm of battle, but even as he fought, he knew that they were being overwhelmed. The enemy was too numerous, and the elves were too few. The walls of Kalanian, once so strong, now buckled under the weight of the assault. Then came the moment Eldrin had feared. A great battering ram, driven by trolls, smashed through the gates with a deafening crash. The enemy poured into the stronghold, and the battle turned into a desperate melee. The elves fought valiantly, but the tide had turned. Kalanian was falling. In the midst of the chaos, Eldrin saw Arian standing atop the central tower, watching as her people fought and died. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. She raised her hand, signaling for the retreat. "The council has spoken," she called to him as he reached her side. "We cannot hold the stronghold. We must flee." Eldrin's heart ached, but he nodded. It was the only choice left. "I will gather those who can still fight," he said. "We will cover the retreat." As the elves began to fall back, retreating through hidden passages into the forest beyond, Eldrin and a handful of warriors made their final stand at the gates, buying time for their people to escape. The enemy pressed harder, and one by one his comrades fell. But Eldrin fought on, his heart heavy with the knowledge that Kalanian, their home, was lost. At last, as the stronghold crumbled around him, Eldrin fell to his knees, his sword slipping from his grasp. The enemy surged past him, but in his final moments he looked to the sky, where the stars of Elbereth still shone faintly above the smoke of battle. Kalanian had fallen, but the elves had not been extinguished. Their light, though dimmed, would endure. Story 9. The Dagger of Morgoth. For centuries, the Dagger of Morgoth had been the stuff of legend, a whispered tale told only in the darkest corners of Middle-earth. It was said that the Dark Lord Morgoth himself, in the depths of Angband, had forged the weapon with his own hands during the First Age, imbuing it with a fragment of his malice and hatred for all living things. Many believed it to be lost forever, buried beneath the ruins of Beleriand, when the land was swallowed by the sea at the end of the War of Wrath. But legends, like curses, have a way of resurfacing when least expected. In the Third Age, during the waning years of peace before Sauron's power fully darkened the lands, the dagger was found, deep beneath the misty mountains, in a forgotten cave system that had once been part of an ancient dwarf kingdom. A group of treasure hunters uncovered a chamber untouched for millennia. They had ventured there seeking gold and jewels, driven by greed, but what they found was far more dangerous than mere wealth. The leader of the group, a man named Beren, had heard rumors of ancient artifacts hidden in the mountain, but even he had not anticipated finding something of such dark power. When they broke through a wall of stone and entered the chamber, their torches flickered and dimmed, as though the very air resisted the presence of light. In the center of the room, lying atop a pedestal of black stone, was the dagger. It was long and cruelly sharp, its blade as black as night, seeming to absorb the light around it. Its hilt was wrapped in ancient leather, worn but unbroken, and strange runes, twisted and hateful, ran along the length of the blade. Beren, despite the warnings of his companions, approached the dagger. He felt an unnatural pull, a compulsion to claim the weapon as his own. His hand trembled as he reached out and grasped the hilt. The moment his fingers closed around it, the surge of cold shot up his arm, freezing his blood and chilling him to the bone. He staggered back, gasping, but the dagger remained in his hand, its dark power already working its way into his soul. The others stepped back in fear, watching as Beren's eyes grew wide, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "What is it?" one of them asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Beren's voice when he spoke was hollow, as though the man they had known was already slipping away. "It is power," he said, his eyes fixed on the blade. "It is death." Word of the discovery spread quickly, and it wasn't long before the artifact drew the attention of scholars and lords from across Middle-earth. Among them was Elenian, a ranger of the north who had long studied the lore of the First Age. When he learned that the dagger of Morgoth had been found, he feared the worst. Ancient texts spoke of the dagger as a conduit of Morgoth's will, capable of spreading corruption and madness to those who wielded it. It was said that any who carried it for too long would fall under its influence, consumed by a lust for power and destruction. Elenian made haste to the misty mountains, determined to see the dagger destroyed before its curse could spread. But when he arrived at the village where Beren and his companions had returned, he found it in ruins. The houses were burned, and the streets were littered with bodies. A shadow had passed over the village, leaving death and despair in its wake. He found Beren alone, sitting in the ruins of what had once been the village square, the dagger clutched in his hand. The man's eyes were hollow, his skin pale and drawn tight over his bones. The air around him was heavy with the stench of decay. Elenian approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Beren," he called softly, though he knew the man before him was only a shell of the one he had once been. "You must let go of the dagger. It is cursed. Its power is not meant for men to wield." Beren's gaze lifted slowly, his eyes filled with a madness that chilled Elenian to the core. "It speaks to me," he whispered. "It shows me things I could never have imagined. I have the power to reshape the world, to claim it for myself. Why should I let go of that?" Elenian stepped closer, his heart heavy with sorrow. He could see the toll the dagger had already taken on Beren, how it had hollowed him out, twisted his soul. He knew there was little time left. "The dagger belongs to Morgoth," Elenian said, his voice firm but gentle. "It is an evil that must be destroyed. If you do not release it, you will be lost." Beren's grip on the dagger tightened, and for a moment it seemed as though he might lash out. But then his face twisted with pain, and he cried out, dropping the dagger as though it burned him. He collapsed to the ground, shaking, the curse that had taken hold of him writhing within his body like a living thing. Elenian acted quickly. He drew his sword and knocked the dagger away, wrapping it in cloth before securing it in his pack. He knew the dangers of keeping it close, but it had to be taken somewhere where it could be destroyed, perhaps in the fires of Mount Doom, where even the most powerful of artifacts could be unmade. But as he looked down at Beren, who lay gasping for breath, his body ravaged by the dagger's curse, he realized the cost of such a weapon. Morgoth's evil was not something that could be contained by mere strength of will. It corrupted all who came into contact with it. Beren, weak and broken, looked up at Elenian, his voice barely a whisper. I thought I could control it. I thought I could use its power for good. No one can control it, Elenian replied, his voice filled with sadness. It was never meant for us. With Beren's life fading before his eyes, Elenian knew there was no time to waste. He took the dagger and began his journey to the only place where such a weapon could be destroyed. But as he traveled south, he could feel the weight of the artifact growing heavier, not just in his pack, but in his mind. The whispers that had ensnared Beren were beginning to creep into his thoughts, subtle and insidious, tempting him with promises of power and glory. Elenian knew that his task was not just to destroy the dagger, but to resist its pull long enough to see it done. The fate of Middle-earth depended on it, for if the dagger of Morgoth were to fall into the wrong hands or worse, if its curse consumed him, an ancient evil would be unleashed once more, and the darkness of the First Age would rise again. Story 10. The Haradrim's Hidden Alley. The winds of war swept across Middle-earth, carrying with them the whispers of alliances and betrayals, of kingdoms rising and falling in the shadow of Sauron's dominion. In the far south, beyond the deserts and jungles, the Haradrim prepared for war. Their people, hardened by the harsh climates of Haradwaith, had long been allies of Sauron, their allegiance bought with promises of power and dominion over the lands of Gondor. Yet, as the Dark Lord's influence grew, so too did the ambitions of the Haradrim. They knew that to truly claim their place in the new world Sauron sought to create, they needed more than just strength of arms. They needed an ally as cunning and powerful as Sauron himself. Word had reached the leaders of the Haradrim of a mysterious power rising in the far east beyond even the lands of Run, where few in the west had ever ventured. The tales spoke of a people whose empire spanned across the uncharted lands of the east, led by a sorcerer king known only as Zaran. It was said that Jaran had once been a servant of dark powers long forgotten, a master of ancient and terrible magic, and that his armies were as countless as the sands of Harad's deserts. But unlike Sauron, Jaran's ambition did not center on conquest for its own sake. He sought something far older, an ancient artifact that had been lost to the sands of time. The Haradrim, sensing an opportunity to tip the balance of power in their favor, sent emissaries to the distant east. The journey was long and perilous, through deserts where the sun blazed mercilessly by day and the cold winds howled by night. The emissaries were men of cunning and strength, chosen for their loyalty and their ability to negotiate with dangerous powers. After many months they arrived at Jaran's court, a sprawling city of black stone and towering spires, where the sky seemed permanently darkened by thick, unnatural clouds. Jaran received the Haradrim emissaries with little fanfare, but his presence was overwhelming. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale as ash, his eyes burning with an eerie golden light. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of command. When he spoke, it was as though the very air trembled at his words. "I know why you have come," Jaran said, his voice echoing in the vast hall of his throne room. "You seek my aid in your war against the West, against Gondor and the free peoples of Middle-earth." The emissaries exchanged cautious glances before one of them stepped forward. "Great Lord, we come in the name of the Haradrim. Our people have long fought beside Sauron, the Dark Lord, and yet we seek more than the scraps he offers. We know of your power, your armies. We believe that, with your strength combined with ours, we can ensure victory, not only for Sauron, but for ourselves." Joran's lips curled into a thin smile. "Sauron, yes, I know of him. He is but one among many who crave dominion over Middle-earth. But what of you? What do the Haradrim seek? Do you wish to be rulers or merely slaves to another dark power?" The emissary faltered for a moment, sensing the danger in Joran's words. "We seek to rule, to claim what is rightfully ours. We have fought and bled for Sauron's cause, but we desire more. We desire our own empire, free from the control of others." Jaran rose from his throne, his golden eyes narrowing. "And you believe I will simply offer you my armies and my magic, expecting nothing in return?" The silence in the hall was oppressive. The emissaries knew they had walked into a den of vipers, but they had little choice. "We offer you an alliance, Lord Jaran," the emissary said, his voice steadier now. "A place in the new world that Sauron seeks to create. Together, we can destroy Gondor and the Western Kingdoms, and you will have the lands you desire. But what is it that you seek?" Jaran's smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. "There is an artifact, an ancient relic of great power, lost in the southern deserts of Harad. It is older than your kingdoms, older than the Dark Lord himself. Find it for me, and I will grant you my armies, my sorcery. With it, I shall have the power to rival even Sauron." The emissaries exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard of many ancient treasures buried beneath the sands of their homeland, but none as dark or as powerful as the one Jaran spoke of. "We will find this artifact," the emissary said, though he did not know if he spoke the truth. "But when we have it, will you truly stand with us against Gondor?" Jaran's expression softened, though his eyes still glowed with that unnatural light. "You will have your war, and I will have what I seek. But beware, men of the south, this power is not easily controlled. The artifact was lost for a reason. Even I do not fully understand the extent of its might. Once it is found, the balance of power in Middle-earth will shift, and none will be able to predict the outcome." With their pact sealed, the Haradrim emissaries returned to their homeland, carrying with them the weight of their alliance with Zoran. Word of the alliance spread through the ranks of the Haradrim armies, filling them with renewed confidence. They now had the backing of a mysterious and powerful ally, one whose strength could match even the Dark Lord's. But with that confidence came a growing sense of unease. The artifact that Jaran sought was shrouded in legend, and even the wisest of the Haradrim did not know where it lay or what dangers it might unleash. Weeks passed, and the search for the artifact began. Haradrim scouts combed the vast deserts, delving into ancient ruins and forgotten tombs. They spoke of strange occurrences, shadows moving where there should be none, and whispers in the wind that chilled the heart. As the search dragged on, it became clear that whatever they were looking for was not meant to be found. Yet, just as hope began to fade, a group of scouts returned from the deep desert, bearing an ancient stone tablet covered in strange runes. The leaders of the Haradrim gathered to study the tablet, and though its meaning was unclear, one thing was certain: it was a map leading to a place long lost to history. The stage was set. The Haradrim had found the first clue to the artifact Jaren desired, and with it the promise of his alliance. But as they prepared to march into the heart of the desert, a growing dread began to settle over their leaders. The artifact, whatever it was, carried with it the weight of ancient evil, and the cost of awakening it might be far greater than they had anticipated. As the Haradrim and their new ally moved closer to their goal, the shadow of Sauron loomed ever larger over Middle-earth. The balance of power was shifting, and in the darkness, forces beyond their comprehension waited for the moment to strike. Story 11. The Secret of the Blue Wizards. For centuries, the fate of the Blue Wizards had been a mystery, a tale lost in the far reaches of Middle-earth's forgotten history. When the Istari first arrived from Valinor, 5 wizards were sent by the Valar to aid in the struggle against Sauron's growing shadow. Gandalf, Saruman, and Radagast were known and revered among the free peoples, their deeds woven into the fabric of the world's history. But the 2 blue wizards, Alatar and Palando, had ventured east into lands uncharted and untamed, and their fate had been swallowed by the vast distances and the passage of time. Many believed they had failed in their mission, perhaps even perished. Yet as the Third Age drew toward its bitter climax and Sauron's power surged once more, rumors began to stir of strange happenings in the Far East, of powers darker than Sauron's rising in lands beyond the reach of Gondor, Rohan, and even Mordor. The truth of those rumors came to light when, after many lifetimes, the Blue Wizards returned. It was Gandalf who first sensed their arrival. In the quiet hours before dawn, as he stood upon a high cliff in Ithilien, watching the eastern sky, he felt a tremor in the air, a ripple of power that he had not felt in an age. It was like the stirring of an old memory, familiar yet distant, tinged with the magic of the West. His eyes narrowed as he watched the faint glimmer of light on the horizon. Somewhere far beyond that line of hills and valleys in the forgotten lands of the East, something had shifted. Days later, in a hidden glade near the banks of the river Anduin, Gandalf came face to face with them. Alatar and Palando had changed. Their robes, once blue and bright as the summer sky, had faded to a darker hue, almost as though they had absorbed the shadows of the lands they had wandered for so long. Their faces were lined with age and weariness, their eyes darkened by the knowledge they now carried. Despite their long absence, the power of the Istari still radiated from them, a reminder that they were not mere men, but Maya, sent to Middle-earth with a purpose that had yet to be fulfilled. Gandalf greeted them with a mixture of surprise and relief, though a shadow of concern lingered behind his eyes. "You have returned at last," he said quietly, his voice steady but cautious. "I feared we had lost you to the east." Alatar, the taller of the 2, nodded slowly. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and resonant, but there was a weight to it, as if carrying the burden of untold years. "We have been far, Gandalf, further than any of the free peoples could imagine. The lands of the East are vast, filled with peoples and powers that have remained hidden from the West for millennia. But what we have learned there, it is worse than we feared." Palando, standing beside him, spoke next, his voice softer, more cautious. "We were sent east to stem the tide of Sauron's influence, to rally the free peoples of those against his shadow. But we discovered something else, something older than Sauron, lurking in the farthest reaches of the world. A power that sleeps but not peacefully. It stirs now as the Dark Lord's dominion grows. Gandalf's brow furrowed. He had known the dangers of the East were great, but this was something new, something that even his deep knowledge had not prepared him for. A power older than Sauron. What could be older than Morgoth's servant? Alatar's face darkened, his eyes distant as if recalling the ancient terrors they had encountered. In the deepest deserts of Khand and beyond, in lands where even the Valar's gaze does not reach, we found ruins. Cities long abandoned, buried under the sands of time. But they were not made by men, nor elves, nor dwarves. The people there spoke of a god who once ruled over all the East, a being of shadow and fire, before even the coming of the Istari. His name is whispered in fear, though none know his true nature. Palando continued, his tone urgent. We followed these stories, hoping to understand, and we found traces of this being's influence. It is as if the earth itself remembers his reign, though his physical form is long gone. But now, with Sauron's power growing, we have felt it too. This being is awakening. His influence spreads like a sickness. Cults have formed in his name, and dark rituals are performed in secret. The people there worship him as a god, believing that he will rise again to claim Middle-earth for himself. Gandalf's heart grew heavy with the weight of this revelation. Sauron alone was a threat that could bring Middle-earth to ruin, but another power, one even older and perhaps darker, was beyond anything they had prepared for. If this being awakens, Gandalf said slowly, then we will face not only Sauron, but a force that could engulf the world. Alatar nodded grimly. That is why we have returned. Sauron's defeat is not enough. If this ancient power is not stopped, it will rise in his place, and Middle-earth will fall under a darkness unlike any we have known. For a long moment, the three wizards stood in silence, the enormity of their task hanging over them like a storm. Gandalf knew that the free peoples were already stretched thin, their strength focused on resisting Sauron's armies. The forces of Gondor, Rohan, and the elves could barely hold back the tide of orcs, trolls, and fell beasts from Mordor. To now face another enemy, one from the east, would be to fight a war on two fronts, one that they were not equipped to win. What do we do? Gandalf asked at last, his voice heavy with the knowledge that there were no easy answers. Palando spoke softly, but with certainty. We must unite the free peoples against this threat, as we did before. But more than that, we must venture east once more, to confront this power before it fully awakens. It is there, in the heart of those lands, that the true battle will be fought. Gandalf nodded, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Could they truly defeat a power older than even Sauron, one that had remained hidden for so long? And if they could not, what hope remained for Middle-earth? As the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows over the land, Gandalf, Alatar, and Palando stood together, knowing that the future of Middle-earth now depended on a battle not yet fought, and on allies who had not yet been found. The blue wizards had returned, but their journey was far from over. The fate of the world hung in the balance, and the secret they carried from the east could change everything. Story 12. The Dark Pact of Run. In the distant lands of Run, far to the east of Middle-earth, the men of the Easterling tribes had long lived in the shadow of Sauron. Though they had once been a proud and independent people, the Dark Lord's influence had seeped into their hearts and minds, twisting their ambitions and feeding their desires for conquest and power. For generations, the men of Run had warred against Gondor, their strength bolstered by promises of Sauron's favor. But as the shadow deepened, Sauron sent forth emissaries with an offer that would change their fate forever, a dark pact that would grant them power beyond their wildest dreams at a price they could scarcely comprehend. Azrael, one of the chieftains of Run, had always been a cautious man. While others in his tribe clamored for glory and dominion over the West, he had seen firsthand the devastation brought by their constant wars. The men of Run were strong, but they were not invincible, and each conflict with Gondor had left their people weakened, their lands scorched, and their numbers thinned. When Sauron's emissaries arrived with the promise of new power, it was Azrael who hesitated while the other chieftains eagerly listened. The emissary, a tall and hooded figure who called himself Ardzog, stood before the gathered chieftains in a grand hall of black stone. His voice was soft, but it carried with it an air of authority and menace. Sauron, the Dark Lord of Mordor, offers you more than just his favor in battle. He offers you power, true power, beyond the reach of your enemies in Gondor. With his gift you will not only defeat the West, but you will subjugate them. You will rule as lords of Middle-earth. Many of the chieftains were swayed immediately. They had fought for so long against the forces of the West that the idea of final victory, of bending Gondor to their will, was too tantalizing to resist. They spoke eagerly of what they would do once their enemies were vanquished, their eyes glittering with ambition. But Azrael, seated at the back of the hall, remained silent, his brow furrowed as he listened. "What is the cost of this power?" Azrael asked finally, his voice cutting through the eager chatter of the others. The hall fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Ardzog smiled, though it did not reach his cold, dark eyes. "The cost is simple," he said. "Your loyalty to the Dark Lord. You will be his vassals, his generals, his instruments in the conquest of Middle-earth. In exchange, he will grant you weapons, soldiers, and magic the likes of which you have never seen." Azrael frowned, sensing that there was more to the deal than Ardzog was revealing. "And what of our people?" he asked. "What becomes of them? Will they live as free men, or as slaves to this power you offer?" Ardzog's smile faded, and his eyes gleamed with something darker. "Your people will know glory," he said, his voice growing colder. "But power always comes with sacrifice. Sauron's gifts are not freely given. The men of Run will serve him, and in doing so, they will share in his dominion. But make no mistake, their lives will belong to the Dark Lord." The room buzzed with uneasy whispers, but many of the chieftains nodded in agreement, too blinded by their own ambitions to see the danger. Azrael, however, felt a deep unease settle in his chest. He had seen men consumed by power before, warlords who had sacrificed their own people in pursuit of victory, only to be left with ashes and ruin. Sauron's offer reeked of such a fate, and Azrael could not shake the feeling that this pact would bring only suffering to Run. That night, as the other chieftains celebrated the pact and drank to their coming victories, Azrael wandered alone through the dark streets of the stronghold. His mind was troubled, his thoughts circling back to Ardzugh's words. Power was a seductive force, and he understood why his fellow chieftains had accepted the deal so eagerly. But Azrael could not forget the stories of the old wars of the men who had once allied with Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, and the ruin that had followed. History had a way of repeating itself, and he feared that this dark alliance would lead Rune down a similar path. As he walked, a voice called out from the shadows, "Chieftain Azrael." He turned to see a figure cloaked in grey standing in the alley, his face hidden by a hood. The man stepped forward, revealing himself to be one of the old seers of Run, a man named Meleth, known for his visions of the future. "I have seen what you fear," Meleth said quietly, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "The pact with Sauron will not bring the victory your people hope for. It will bring only darkness." Azrael's heart quickened. "You have seen this?" Meleth nodded. "In my visions I saw the men of Run marching under Sauron's banner, their eyes hollow, their souls consumed by his will. They became more like beasts than men, their minds twisted by the dark magic that Sauron will unleash upon them. The power he offers is a lie, it is a chain that will bind your people to his service forever." Azrael clenched his fists, anger and frustration boiling within him. And yet the other chieftains are blind to this. They see only conquest. "Their pride blinds them," Meleth said softly. "But you still have a choice, Azrael. You can refuse the pact. You can stand against this darkness." Azrael shook his head, doubt clouding his thoughts. "What choice do I have? The chieftains have already accepted. I am only one man. One man can make a difference," Meleth replied, stepping closer. "If you stand against this, others may follow. But you must act quickly. Once the pact is sealed, it will be too late." The next morning the chieftains gathered to swear their oaths of loyalty to Sauron, led by Ardzugh. The air was thick with anticipation as they prepared to bind their fates to the Dark Lord, but as Azrael stood among them, the weight of Meleth's words pressed heavily on his mind. When the moment came for him to take the oath, Azrael hesitated. His voice caught in his throat as he looked around at the faces of his fellow chieftains, and then beyond them to the people of Run, who would bear the burden of this dark alliance. "I will not swear this oath," Azrael declared, his voice steady but firm. The hall fell silent, and all eyes turned to him in shock. Ardzugh's eyes narrowed, and a dangerous smile spread across his face. "You refuse the Dark Lord's gift." Azrael stood tall, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. "I refuse to sell the souls of my people for a power that will destroy us." Chaos erupted in the hall as the other chieftains shouted and cursed, demanding that Azrael submit, but he would not. He turned and walked out of the hall, knowing that his defiance would make him an enemy of Sauron and his allies. But he also knew that if he did nothing, his people would be lost to a darkness from which there would be no return. As he stepped into the bright light of day, Azrael knew the path ahead would be dangerous, but it was a path he would walk with honor. He would fight to save his people from the darkness, even if it meant standing alone against the might of Sauron. Story 13. The Fall of Ostin Edhill. Ostin Edhill, the city of the elves, had once been a beacon of beauty and craft in Middle-earth. Nestled in the land of Eregion, It was a place where the finest works of the elven smiths, led by Celebrimbor, were wrought in secret. It was here that the rings of power had been forged, masterpieces of skill and magic. For years the city flourished under the guidance of Celebrimbor and the Gwaith Myrdain, a brotherhood of artisans renowned for their craftsmanship. But their greatest works would become the source of their undoing, for Sauron, in the guise of Anatar, had deceived them, guiding their hands toward a darker purpose. The fall of Ostin Edhill began with whispers, rumors carried on the wind of an approaching storm. Sauron's armies had begun to stir in the east, and though the elves had long prepared for war, they could not have foreseen the full extent of the assault that awaited them. The betrayal of Anatar had cut deep. Celebrimbor, having learned of Sauron's true intentions, had forged the three rings in secret Vilya, Narya and Nenya without the Dark Lord's knowledge, and he had sent them away for safekeeping. But Sauron, now fully aware of the threat these rings posed to his dominion, would stop at nothing to claim them. The sky above Ostin Edhill darkened as Sauron's forces, a vast army of orcs, trolls and darker creatures from the depths of Mordor, marched toward the city. Their banners, black as night, fluttered in the foul wind that carried the scent of death and destruction. The elves of a region stood ready upon the battlements, their armor gleaming in the dim light, their eyes hard with determination. But even the most skilled warriors of the elves knew they faced a foe unlike any they had fought before. Sauron himself led this army, his malice palpable, a shadow that seemed to stretch across the land like a living thing. Celebrimbor stood at the highest tower of his city, watching as the horizon filled with the dark shapes of Sauron's legions. His heart was heavy with regret. He had been deceived, and now his people would pay the price for his ambition. Yet there was no time for remorse. The three rings had been sent away, hidden with trusted allies, but Sauron believed they were still within the city. Celebrimbor knew that Ostin Edhill would fall, but he was determined to protect the secret of the rings, even if it meant his life. The first blow came like a thunderclap. Siege engines, massive and grotesque, hurled stones and fire at the city's walls, shaking the very foundations of the city. The gates groaned under the assault, and soon the orcs charged, their guttural cries filling the air. Elven archers loosed volley after volley of arrows, their shafts striking true, but for every orc that fell, two more took its place. The elves fought bravely, their swords flashing in the gloom, but they were vastly outnumbered. Within the city, the civilians were being evacuated. The narrow streets, once filled with laughter and song, were now filled with the hurried footsteps of those seeking refuge. Mothers clutched their children, and the young and old alike made their way toward the secret passages that led into the mountains. But many knew that escape was fleeting. The shadow of Sauron was too vast, too consuming. On the front lines, Elrond, one of the greatest captains of the elves, fought valiantly, his sword cutting through the ranks of orcs, like a beacon of light in the dark. Beside him, the warriors of a region held the line, but the weight of Sauron's forces was too great. The gates of the city, reinforced with elven magic, began to buckle under the relentless assault. The ground shook as a great battering ram wielded by trolls crashed against the wood and stone. Celebrimbor knew the moment had come. As the walls crumbled and the gates were breached, He gathered the remaining leaders of the city in the hall of the Myrdain. They knew they could not hold the city, but they could still protect the secret of the three rings. "We cannot allow Sauron to claim the rings," Celebrimbor said, his voice firm despite the chaos that raged outside. "He must believe they are here, or he will pursue them beyond our borders." Elrond entered the hall, bloodied but unbowed. "The city is lost," he said grimly. "We must retreat while we still can. Take what remains of our people into the mountains." But Celebrimbor shook his head. "I will not leave. If Sauron finds no resistance, he will know the rings are gone. I must stay and give him what he desires, or at least make him believe he has found it." Elrond's eyes widened in understanding. "You would sacrifice yourself?" "If that is what it takes to protect the rings, then yes," Celebrimbor replied, his voice steady. "My life is forfeit, but the three must remain hidden." Reluctantly, Elrond nodded, knowing that there was no other choice. As Celebrimbor prepared for the final defense of the city, Elrond led the remaining survivors toward the hidden paths in the mountains, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the city and perhaps the future of the elves hung by a thread. The final battle for Ostin Eadhill was swift and brutal. Sauron himself entered the city, a dark figure wreathed in shadow, his will bending even the bravest of elves to their knees. The air seemed to burn with his presence, and as his forces surged through the broken gates, Celebrimbor stood alone in the tower, awaiting his fate. Sauron's voice echoed through the city, a terrible sound that chilled the blood of all who heard it. "Where are the rings, Celebrimbor? You cannot hide them from me." Celebrimbor stood defiant, though he knew it was the end. "You will never find them, Dark Lord. They are beyond your reach." Sauron approached him, his eyes burning like coals. "Then you will die in vain," he hissed, and with a wave of his hand, the shadows around him surged forward, enveloping the Elf Lord. The city of Ostin Eadhill fell that day, its walls reduced to rubble, its streets stained with the blood of its defenders. Celebrimbor, the last hope of a region, was taken and tortured, but he never revealed the location of the three rings. His sacrifice ensured that Sauron's victory was incomplete, for though the city was lost, the rings remained hidden, far from the Dark Lord's grasp. As the flames of Ostin Eadhill burned into the night, the survivors who had fled into the mountains looked back in sorrow, knowing that a great light had been extinguished. But they also knew that hope still lingered, carried in secret by those who held the three rings. Sauron's triumph was not yet complete, and the battle for Middle-earth was far from over. Story 14. The Corruption of Numenor's Kings. Numenor, the island gifted to the Edain by the Valar, had once been the greatest realm of men in all of Middle-earth. Its people were blessed with long life, wisdom, and the friendship of the elves, and its kings were noble, ruling with justice and honor. But over the centuries, the seed of pride began to take root in the hearts of Numenor's rulers. They had been given many gifts, but the one gift they desired most, the immortality of the elves, was denied to them. That yearning, that resentment toward death, would be the first crack in the foundation of Numenor's greatness. It was through that crack that Sauron, the Dark Lord of Mordor, would eventually seep in, corrupting the island's kings one by one, twisting them into tyrants bent on domination. The fall of Numenor's kings did not happen all at once. It was a slow, insidious process that began long before Sauron ever set foot on the island. Tar-Atanamir, the 13th king of Numenor, was the first to openly defy the will of the Valar. Under his rule, the Númenóreans became increasingly obsessed with their mortality. Though they still enjoyed long lives, they began to fear death more than ever before, seeing it as an injustice rather than a natural part of their existence. Tar-Atanamir refused to surrender his life willingly when his time came, clinging to life long past the point where his body had withered and decayed. His defiance set a dangerous precedent for those who followed. After Tar-Atanar's death, his successors grew even more prideful. They turned their backs on the elves, severing the ancient bonds of friendship that had once connected Númenor to the Undying Lands. Under the rule of Tar-Palantir, there was a brief attempt to restore the old ways, to mend the relationship with the Valar and the elves, but it was too late. The corruption had taken too deep a hold in the hearts of Numenous people, and many of them resented Tar-Palantir's efforts. They longed for power, not humility, and the idea of bending the knee to the Valar felt like a submission they could no longer endure. It was during the reign of Ar-Pharazôn, the last and most powerful of Numenor's kings, that the corruption of Numenor reached its peak. Ar-Pharazôn was a warrior king, proud and mighty, and his ambitions stretched far beyond the shores of his island kingdom. He sought to make Numenor the supreme power in Middle-earth, and in doing so, he marched against Sauron, the Dark Lord, intending to conquer him and bring him to heel. Ar-Pharazôn's armies were vast, and his strength unmatched by any of the kingdoms of men. But Sauron, cunning and devious, did not resist. When the king's armies arrived at the gates of Barad-dûr, Sauron came forth not as a defiant enemy, but as a humble servant. Bowing before the might of Númenor, feigning submission, Sauron allowed himself to be taken back to Númenor in chains, but it was all part of his plan. Once on the island, Sauron's true work began. He was brought before Ar-Pharazôn as a prisoner, but he quickly gained favor with the king. His words were smooth, his manner charismatic, and he played upon the desires that already simmered within Númenor's rulers, their fear of death and their yearning for power beyond mortal limits. In secret councils, Sauron whispered dark truths to Ar-Pharazôn. He spoke of the Valar not as benevolent guardians, but as jealous tyrants who sought to keep men subservient. He painted death not as the gift of Iluvatar, but as a curse placed upon men to keep them weak. The elves, Sauron claimed, were no friends to Númenor. They were agents of the Valar, working to ensure that men never rose to their true potential. Under Sauron's guidance, Ar-Pharazôn's heart hardened, and he began to see the Valar and the elves as enemies to be conquered. Sauron introduced new practices to the court of Númenor. He spoke of Melkor, the first Dark Lord and Sauron's former master, as a being who had been misunderstood and wronged by the Valar. Sauron promised Ar-Pharazôn that if he embraced Melkor's teachings, he could gain the immortality that had always been denied to men. Slowly, under Sauron's influence, the king's court shifted from a place of light and wisdom to a dark and foreboding seat of power. Statues of Melkor were raised, and secret rites were performed in his honor. The Númenóreans began to worship the darkness, believing that through these rituals they would conquer death. Ar-Pharazôn, driven by Sauron's manipulation, and his own unquenchable thirst for power, sought to dominate all of Middle-earth. He built great fleets of ships, and the Númenórean armies spread across the world, enslaving lesser men and extracting tribute from distant lands. Númenor's glory became a shadow of its former self, its once noble purpose twisted into an empire of conquest and fear. The island's rulers, once guided by wisdom, now ruled with an iron fist, their cruelty growing with each passing year. But as Númenor's kings descended further into darkness, a growing resistance formed among the faithful, those who still held true to the old ways and remained loyal to the Valar. Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, were among these faithful, and they watched with sorrow as their beloved homeland fell deeper into Sauron's grasp. Though they tried to warn Ar-Pharazôn of the dangers of trusting Sauron, their pleas fell on deaf ears. The king had become too entangled in Sauron's lies, too consumed by his own desire to challenge the Valar. In the end, Sauron's greatest deception came in the form of a promise that would seal Númenor's doom. He whispered to Ar-Pharazôn that if he were truly to master death, he would need to seize the ultimate power, the Undying Lands themselves. Sauron convinced the king that if he set sail for Aman, the land of the Valar, and claimed it for Númenor, he would become immortal, and the Valar would be powerless to stop him. Ar-Pharazôn, blinded by his pride and ambition, accepted this as truth. He prepared the greatest fleet Númenor had ever known, and he set sail westward, defying the ban of the Valar and seeking to claim immortality by force. But the Valar would not allow such an act to go unchallenged. As Ar-Pharazôn's fleet approached Aman, the wrath of the Valar was unleashed. Uru-Ilúvatar himself intervened, and in a cataclysmic event, the world was reshaped. Númenor was swallowed by the sea, its great cities and proud people drowned beneath the waves. The island that had once been the greatest realm of men was gone, destroyed by the pride and corruption of its kings. Only a few of the faithful survived, led by Elendil and his sons, who fled eastward to Middle-earth. They carried with them the memory of Númenor's greatness and its tragic fall, vowing never to forget the lessons of their forebears. The kings of Númenor, once noble and wise, had been twisted into tyrants by Sauron's lies, and their pride had led them to their ultimate doom. The fall of Númenor was a warning to all of Middle-earth, a reminder that even the greatest of realms could be brought low by the corruption of power and the fear of death. Story 15. The Fall of Fornost. Fornost, the ancient capital of the Kingdom of Arnor, had once been a proud and noble city, its walls standing tall against the wild lands of the north. Known as the North Downs by many, it had been a symbol of strength and resilience, guarding the northern realms from the shadowy forces that had long threatened the free peoples of Middle-earth. But as Sauron's influence grew across the land, even the once great city of Fornost could not escape the creeping darkness that spread from the south. The Witch King of Angmar, Sauron's most fearsome servant, had set his sights on the north, and now Fornost found itself besieged by an overwhelming force. The siege of Fornost had begun with the sound of distant horns, faint at first, but growing louder as the armies of Angmar marched closer. The people of Fornost had known that war was coming. Rumors of Angmar's growing power had reached their ears for years, but nothing had prepared them for the full scale of the assault. The Witch King had gathered an army unlike any seen before in the north. Orcs, trolls, wargs, and men who had fallen under Sauron's sway. They poured from the mountains of Angmar like a flood, darkening the land as they advanced on Fornost. King Arvedui, the last king of Arna, stood upon the walls of his city, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. His kingdom had already been weakened by centuries of internal strife, division, and war, and now, with the full might of Angmar at their gates, it seemed that the end of Fornost was inevitable. But Arvai was not a man to surrender without a fight. He had sent word to the southern kingdoms, to Gondor, pleading for aid, but no help had come. The people of Fornost were alone. As the sun set on the first day of the siege, the army of Angmar reached the walls of the city. The ground trembled beneath the weight of their numbers, and the air was thick with the smell of death. The Witch King himself rode at the head of the army, clad in black armor, his face hidden beneath a cruel iron helm. His very presence seemed to sap the courage of the defenders, casting a pall of dread over the city. Within Fornost, the people prepared for battle. The soldiers of Arna, though few, were brave and skilled. They had fought many battles before, and they would fight to defend their city with every ounce of strength they had left. Among them was Eldarien, a young captain whose lineage traced back to the ancient kings of Numina. He had grown up hearing stories of the great heroes of old Isildur, Elendil, and the mighty warriors who had once stood against Sauron in the War of the Last Alliance. Now, as he donned his armor and took up his sword, he knew that the fate of his people rested in the hands of those who stood upon the walls of Fornost. As night fell, the battle began in earnest. Angmar's forces launched wave after wave of attacks against the city's defenses. The walls of Fornost shook under the impact of battering rams and siege engines, and the sky was lit with the fiery glow of catapulted stones. The defenders fought valiantly, repelling the invaders with arrows and boiling oil, but for every enemy they struck down, more surged forward. The sheer numbers of Angmar's army were overwhelming, and it became clear that Fornost could not hold out forever. Eldarien fought on the front lines, his sword flashing in the dim light as he cut through the ranks of orcs. He had trained his whole life for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the chaos and horror of battle. All around him, the clash of steel and the screams of the dying filled the air. His comrades fell beside him, and the stench of blood and smoke choked his lungs. But he fought on, driven by a desperate determination to protect his home. Above the battlefield, the Witch King watched the carnage unfold, his cold eyes fixed on the city. He could sense the fear in the hearts of the defenders, the weakening of their spirits as his army pressed harder against the walls. He knew that it was only a matter of time before Fornost fell. The power of Angmar was too great, and the men of Arna were too few. With a single, chilling cry, he commanded his forces forward, and the final assault began. The walls of Fornost, long thought impenetrable, finally gave way. With a deafening crash, the gates were breached, and the army of Angmar poured into the city like a black tide. The defenders were forced to fall back, retreating deeper into the city as the enemy overwhelmed them. Streets that had once been filled with the laughter of children and the songs of the elves were now soaked with blood. The people of Fornost, those who could not fight, fled in terror, seeking refuge in the city's inner sanctums. King Arvedui, knowing that the city was lost, gathered his remaining forces in the central keep. He had no intention of surrendering to the Witch King, for he knew what fate awaited those who fell into the hands of Sauron's lieutenant. Instead, he planned to make a final stand, to buy time for the women and children of Fornost to escape through secret tunnels that led into the wilds of the north. His heart ached for his people, for his kingdom, but he knew that this was the end. Eldarien and the other captains joined the king in the keep, their faces grim with the knowledge of what was to come. They knew that there would be no reinforcements, no last-minute salvation. They were alone, surrounded by the enemy, but they would fight until the last breath left their bodies. The final battle within the walls of Fornost was a desperate, bloody affair. The Witch King's forces pressed ever closer, and though the defenders fought with all their might, they were pushed back inch by inch. Eldarien, his body weary from battle, stood at the king's side, his sword stained with the blood of orcs and men alike. He knew that death was inevitable, but he refused to give in to despair. He fought for every moment, every heartbeat, for the hope that some might survive. In the end, the Witch King himself entered the keep, his presence sending a wave of terror through the hearts of the defenders. His voice, cold and cruel, echoed through the hall. "Kneel before me, King of Fornost," he hissed. "Your kingdom is fallen. Your people are mine." But Ovidiu did not kneel. With a defiant cry, he raised his sword and charged the Witch King, knowing full well that it would be his last act. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. Ovdui fell, his body crumpling to the ground as the Witch King's blade pierced his heart. As the last light of Fornost faded, the city fell into darkness. Its people were scattered, its walls reduced to rubble, and its king slain. The kingdom of Arna, once proud and mighty, was no more, but even in defeat the spirit of the north lived on, carried by the survivors who fled into the wilderness. They would remember Fornost, and the day it fell to the shadow, and one day they vowed they would rise again. Story 16. The Lost Sword of Gil-galad. In the deep and forgotten histories of Middle-earth, few relics were spoken of with as much reverence as Aeglos, the legendary spear wielded by Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor. But in the midst of his storied legacy, there existed another weapon, one less known but no less powerful, the sword Gil-galad carried at his side during the last alliance, a blade forged in the fires of Valinor itself. This sword, lost after Gil-galad's tragic death on the slopes of Mount Doom, had passed into legend, its fate unknown even to the wisest of the elves. For centuries it was believed that the sword had been destroyed, its light extinguished along with the last king of the Noldor. But like so many things tied to the great powers of the world, its disappearance was not the end. In the waning days of the Third Age, rumors began to spread across the lands, whispers of a forgotten sword, found in the wilds beyond the misty mountains, a relic of immense power. At first, these rumors were dismissed as mere tavern talk treasure hunters weaving tales to give weight to their quests. But then came reports from the north, where rangers and elves alike had encountered strange forces, shadows moving in places once thought safe. The rumors could no longer be ignored, and word soon reached the ears of those who remembered the ancient legends. It was Elrond, Lord of Rivendell, and one of the last to have fought beside Gil-galad, who knew the truth. He had seen the blade with his own eyes during the last alliance, when it had cleaved through the forces of Sauron with the strength of the High King behind it. If the sword had been found, it would carry with it not only the legacy of Gil-galad, but also the potential for great power. And in the wrong hands, that power could bring devastation to Middle-earth. Elrond dispatched a group of his most trusted allies to investigate, led by Erestor, a wise and seasoned elf of Rivendell. Alongside him was Valandil, a young ranger of the north whose lineage traced back to the Númenóreans who had fought under Elendil. The two set out with a small company, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that what they sought might not be something they wished to find. For weeks they traveled through the northern wilderness, scouring ancient ruins and forgotten paths, following the trail of rumors and faint whispers. As they ventured deeper into the wilds, a growing sense of unease settled over them. The land itself seemed to darken, the trees standing like silent sentinels, watching with unseen eyes. The air grew colder, and the light seemed to dim, even during the brightest hours of the day. At last, in a desolate valley where few dared to tread, they found it. Hidden within the ruins of an ancient fortress, crumbled and worn by time, the sword lay in a stone crypt, untouched by the ages. Its blade gleamed faintly in the gloom, silver and bright, etched with runes that spoke of its noble origins. As Erestor approached, he could feel the power radiating from it, a force both awe-inspiring and terrifying. "This is it," Valandil whispered, his voice barely audible. "Gil-galad's sword." Erestor nodded, but his heart was troubled. Something about the sword's presence felt wrong, as though it had been waiting all these years not to be found, but to awaken. "We must be cautious," Erestor said quietly. "Such power does not lie dormant for so long without purpose." They lifted the sword carefully from its resting place, and as they did, the air seemed to shift. A low rumble echoed through the ruins, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. The company drew their weapons, instinctively preparing for danger, but the threat did not come from without. Instead, a shadow fell over their hearts, a sense of dread and foreboding that gnawed at their very souls. In the days that followed, as they journeyed back toward Rivendell, the effects of the sword became clear. Valandil, who had been tasked with carrying it, began to change. At first it was subtle. He grew more distant, his gaze often lingering on the blade, his hands rarely leaving its hilt. But soon darker signs emerged. His temper flared without warning, and his once kind eyes hardened with a cold, calculating look. The sword's power, once a tool of righteousness in Gil-galad's hands, had begun to corrupt him. Erestor, alarmed by Valandil's transformation, attempted to intervene. "You must let me carry the sword," he said one evening as they made camp. "Its burden is too great for any one man to bear for long." Valandil's eyes flashed with anger. "It is not a burden," he replied, his voice sharp and brittle. "It is my destiny." "Destiny?" Erestor's concern deepened. "This sword belongs to no one. It was forged in the light of Valinor, and its purpose was to defend, not to conquer." But Valandil would not be swayed. "You do not understand, Erestor. With this sword I can unite the North. I can restore the strength of the Dunedain and reclaim the glory of Númenor. We need not wait for kings or lords to save us. The power is in my hands." Erestor knew then that the sword's corruption had already taken hold. It whispered to Valandil's deepest desires, twisting his noble intentions into something darker. The blade, once a symbol of hope, had become a tool of domination. Its light turned to shadow. Arrestor had no choice. That night, while Valandil slept, he attempted to take the sword from him. But Valandil was no longer the man he had been. He awoke as if sensing the betrayal, and in a fury he drew the sword, the blade gleaming with a terrible light. "You would steal my power." Valandil snarled, his voice no longer his own. "You would deny me my right." Arrestor drew his own blade, his heart heavy with grief. "I am trying to save you, Valandil. This sword is not meant for you or for anyone." The battle was swift and brutal. Valandil, fueled by the sword's dark power, fought with the strength of many, his strikes swift and merciless. But Arrestor, with centuries of experience and wisdom on his side, managed to disarm him, knocking the sword from his grip. As the blade fell from Valandil's hand, the young ranger collapsed to the ground, the corruption loosening its hold on him as the sword lay dormant once more. With Valandil unconscious, Arrestor took the sword and wrapped it in cloth, determined to return it to Rivendell, where it could be hidden, its power sealed away. But even as he carried it, he could feel the weight of its influence pressing on his mind, tempting him with visions of power and glory. He knew that the sword's reappearance had come with a terrible cost. As Arrestor made his way back to Rivendell, he could not shake the sense that the sword's discovery had been no accident. Sauron's influence still lingered in the world, and the sword, though a relic of the past, carried within it the potential to shape the future. The question remained, would it be used for good, or would it become a weapon of darkness once more? In the quiet halls of Rivendell, Elrond received the sword with sorrow in his heart, knowing that even the greatest of relics carried the seeds of destruction. The sword of Gil-galad, lost and found, was returned to its place of rest, but the shadow of its power would not be forgotten. Story 17. The Siege of Barad-dûr. The siege of Barad-dûr had begun with hope, the armies of elves and men standing united in their defiance of Sauron, the Dark Lord. For years the forces of the Last Alliance, led by Gil-galad, High King of the Elves, and Elendil, King of the Dúneign, had fought against the armies of Mordor. Victory after victory had brought them to the very heart of Sauron's realm, and now they stood at the base of Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower. It loomed above them, a fortress of black stone, wreathed in shadow and malice. The great siege engines of the Alliance battered its walls day and night, while the armies of Sauron poured out in wave after wave, desperate to break the encirclement. For 7 years the siege dragged on. The alliance was vast, comprised of elves, men, and even dwarves, but the forces of Mordor were relentless. Orcs, trolls, and other foul creatures bred in the pits of Barad-dûr continued to swell Sauron's ranks, and though many fell, more always seemed to take their place. Every night the skies above the Dark Tower burned with an eerie red light, the fires of Mount Doom casting a crimson glow over the battlefield. The ground was stained with the blood of countless warriors, and the air was thick with the stench of death. Elrond, then still young but already one of the most trusted captains of Gil-galad, stood among the ruins of an ancient watchtower, his eyes fixed on the walls of Barad-dûr. The siege had begun with such promise, But as the years dragged on, doubt had crept into the hearts of many. The dark tower seemed impregnable, its walls infused with Sauron's dark sorcery. No matter how many assaults they launched, the defenses held, and the cost in lives was growing unbearable. He turned to Isildur, the son of Elendil, who stood beside him. The two had fought together through countless battles, but even Isildur, known for his unbreakable will, now seemed weighed down by the length of the siege. "It seems endless," Isildur muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "We could batter the walls for another decade, and they would not yield." Elrond nodded, but his gaze remained on the tower. "Sauron has made Barad-dûr a fortress of his will. As long as he remains within, it may be that no force can bring it down. But we cannot abandon the siege now. We are too close." Isildur's hand gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. "My father believes that Sauron will be forced to come out eventually, that he cannot remain in hiding forever." Elrond gave a faint, bitter smile. "That is what we hope." Yet Sauron was patient. He had long ago mastered the art of war through deception and manipulation, and he had no intention of meeting the last alliance on their terms. As the siege wore on, a quiet tension settled over the battlefield, and many began to wonder what the Dark Lord was truly waiting for. One evening, as the armies of the Alliance prepared for another assault, word came from the northern flank. A breach had been discovered in the outer defenses, an ancient tunnel leading beneath the foundations of Barad-dûr, one that had gone unnoticed by both sides for centuries. It was an opportunity that could not be ignored, a possible way to penetrate the Dark Tower from within. If they could use the tunnel to infiltrate the fortress, they might be able to strike at the heart of Sauron's power. Elendil, Gil-galad, and their most trusted captains gathered to discuss the discovery. The risk was great, but so too was the potential reward. If they could bypass the outer defenses, they might be able to deal a decisive blow, perhaps even destroy Sauron himself. After much deliberation, it was decided that a small force, led by Isildur and Elrond, would enter the tunnel and scout the way ahead. If the path was clear, they would follow with reinforcements and strike at the Dark Lord's inner sanctum. The tunnel was narrow and suffocating, its walls lined with ancient stone, slick with moisture and the stench of decay. Isildur led the way, his sword drawn, while Elrond followed close behind, his keen elven senses alert for any sign of danger. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became, as if the very earth was pressing down on them. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing through the darkness. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a vast cavern beneath Barad-dûr. The air here was thick with an unnatural cold, and the ground was covered in strange, twisted roots that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. In the center of the cavern, a massive stone door stood before them, its surface carved with ancient runes of power. Isildur's eyes gleamed with determination as he approached the door, but Elrond felt a growing sense of dread. "This is wrong," Elrond whispered, his hand gripping Isildur's arm. "We should not go further. Sauron would not leave such a weakness unguarded." But Isildur, driven by the years of war and the desire to bring an end to the siege, shrugged off Elrond's warning. "We have come too far to turn back now. This is the chance we have been waiting for." With a deep breath, Isildur pushed open the door. What lay beyond was not an inner chamber or a hidden passage, but a vast chasm filled with a swirling vortex of black smoke and fire. The moment the door opened, the ground beneath them began to tremble violently, and the very air seemed to scream with the force of the trap they had triggered. Sauron's laughter echoed through the cavern, a sound that sent a chill through every heart. "This is his doing," Elrond shouted, grabbing Isildur's arm and pulling him back. "It's a trap." The cavern began to collapse around them, the walls crumbling as the dark energy within the chasm surged outward. The roots that had lined the ground came to life, writhing and twisting, seeking to ensnare them. Elrond and Isildur fought their way back through the tunnel, narrowly avoiding the crushing debris as the very foundations of Barad-dûr began to quake. When they emerged from the tunnel, the sight that met them was even more terrifying. The forces of Mordor, once held at bay by the siege, now poured from the gates of the Dark Tower in a full assault. Sauron had been waiting for this moment, luring the Alliance into a deadly trap beneath his fortress. With the tunnel collapsed, their chance at infiltration had been lost, and now the forces of the last Alliance were thrown into disarray. Elendil and Gil-galad, seeing the chaos unfold, rallied their armies for a desperate defense. The battle that followed was brutal and unforgiving, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The forces of men and elves fought valiantly, but the weight of Sauron's armies, combined with the devastating trap, threatened to overwhelm them. In the midst of the carnage, Sauron himself emerged, clad in black armor, wielding the One Ring. His presence was like a shadow falling over the battlefield, and those who faced him trembled in fear. Elendil and Gil-galad, knowing that the fate of Middle-earth hung in the balance, charged to meet him. The final confrontation was swift and deadly. Gil-galad fell first, his body consumed by Sauron's fiery touch, and Elendil followed soon after, his sword breaking beneath the weight of the Dark Lord's power. But Isildur, fueled by a mixture of grief and fury, seized the broken hilt of his father's sword and struck Sauron down, severing the One Ring from his hand. Though Sauron's physical form was destroyed, the victory was hollow. The armies of the last Alliance had been decimated, and the trap beneath Barad-dûr had cost them dearly. The One Ring, instead of being destroyed, was taken by Isildur, its dark influence already beginning to corrupt him. The siege had ended, but the shadow of Sauron had not been vanquished. Middle-earth had won a fragile reprieve, but the cost of that victory would be felt for generations to come. Story 18. The Sorrows of Lórien. Lothlórien, the Golden Wood, had long been a place of peace and sanctuary, a realm untouched by the wars and sorrows of Middle-earth. Its trees, tall and ancient, shimmered with a golden light, and the power of Galadriel, Lady of Lórien, safeguarded the land. Under her rule, the elves of Lórien lived in tranquility, shielded from the dark tides of war and the encroaching shadow of Sauron. But beneath the surface, unrest had begun to stir. Whispers passed among the elves of Caras Galadon, the heart of the woodland realm, questioning the growing power of their lady and the secretive nature of her magic. Many feared that Galadriel's strength came not from the ancient wisdom of the Eldar, but from a connection to a far darker source, the One Ring. Galadriel had ruled Lothlórien for millennia, but it was the forging of the rings of power that had forever changed her fate. She bore Nenya, the Ring of Water, one of the 3 rings of the elves, and with it she maintained the timeless beauty and protection of Lothlorien. But as Sauron's influence grew in Mordor and the One Ring's power stirred, many began to fear that the darkness of the ring could taint even the Lady of Lorien herself. Though Nenya was not bound to Sauron's will, the One Ring held dominion over all others, and Galadriel's enemies whispered that she was vulnerable to its corruption. In the twilight of Lothlorien's long peace, a faction of elves began to question their lady's leadership, fearing that her power had grown too great and her motives too inscrutable. Among these dissenters was Amrathur, an elf of noble lineage, who had once fought in the wars of the Second Age and had seen the devastation wrought by Sauron's influence. He had long respected Galadriel, but as the years passed and the shadow of Mordor grew, he began to question the wisdom of placing their trust in a ruler who held such power in her hands. The One Ring calls to all lesser rings, Amrathur said one night as he gathered with other elves in a secret glade deep within the forest. Even the 3, though they were made in secret, are bound to its fate. Can we truly trust that Galadriel, mighty as she is, will not succumb to the temptation of wielding that power? I have seen what happens when elves fall to ambition when they seek power that is not meant for them. Others nodded in agreement. Though Galadriel had never shown signs of falling to darkness, the mere presence of Nenya and its connection, however indirect, to the One Ring was enough to stir unease among those who remembered the wars of the past. They feared that Galadriel's connection to such power would lead Lothlorien into ruin, just as Númenor had been destroyed by the ambition of its rulers. We cannot allow Lothlorien to become another realm consumed by the desire for domination, Amrathur continued. If the lady cannot separate herself from Nenya, then we must act. Their plan was simple, but dangerous. They would confront Galadriel, urging her to either relinquish Nenya or step down as ruler of Lothlorien. Though they knew such a confrontation could lead to division within the realm, they believed it was necessary to protect the future of their people. What they did not fully understand was that Galadriel, too, wrestled with the burden of Nenya. She had long known that her power over Lothlorien came not only from her own strength, but from the ring she bore. She had resisted the temptation to use it for personal gain, but as Sauron's power grew, so too did the shadow over her heart. She feared that if the One Ring were ever found, its influence would reach even her, and Lothlorien would fall under its sway. Word of Amrathur's descent reached Galadriel before the confrontation took place. She had long sensed the growing discontent among her people, and though it pained her, she understood their fears. On the eve of the confrontation, she called upon Amrathur to meet her in the highest chamber of Caras Galadon, where the light of the stars filtered through the mollon trees, casting long shadows over the floor. "You fear me," Galadriel said quietly, her voice filled with sorrow. "You fear what I might become because of the power I hold." Amrathur, though proud and unyielding, felt the weight of her words. "I fear what the rings might make you, lady," he replied. "We have seen what such power can do, even to the best of us. The longer you hold Nenya, the greater the risk. We cannot allow Lothlorien to fall to the same darkness that consumed so many others. Galadriel gazed at him with eyes that had seen ages pass, and her voice grew soft. Do you believe I have not struggled with this myself? Nenya is not a burden I carry lightly. I have resisted its pull, not for my sake, but for the sake of this land. Without Nenya, Lothlorien would have withered long ago. The light you see in the trees, the peace you feel in these woods, that is Nenya's doing. But you are right to be cautious. Power can corrupt even the wisest. Amruther stood silent for a long moment. He had expected defiance, perhaps even anger, but not this quiet admission of the very fears that haunted him. You have the power to walk away, he said finally, to leave the ring behind. Galadriel smiled sadly. If only it were that simple. Even if I cast Nenya aside, the shadow of Sauron's ring would remain. As long as the One exists, no land, no people will be truly free. You do not trust me because of what I bear, and I do not fault you for it. But understand this, I hold Nenya not out of desire for dominion, but out of love for Lothlorien and all who dwell within it. Then why not leave? Amruther pressed. Why not take your people beyond the seas, away from the shadow of Mordor? Because Galadriel answered, her voice full of the weight of her decision, this is our home, and if we abandon it to the darkness, what hope remains for Middle-earth? Amruther's resolve faltered. He could not deny the truth of her words, nor could he deny the love he still felt for his home. He lowered his head. What would you have me do, my lady? Trust me, Galadriel said, her eyes piercing yet kind. Trust that I will not allow this land to fall into shadow. I have borne the burden of Nenya for millennia. I will continue to bear it until the time comes when it must be relinquished. But that time is not yet. We are all bound by fate, Amruther, but as long as we stand together, the shadow cannot overcome us. Amruther said nothing more. The confrontation, which had begun with the threat of division, ended in a fragile understanding. Yet the sorrows of Lorien were far from over. Sauron's power continued to grow, and as the One Ring drew closer to being found, the fate of Galadriel, Lothlorien, and all of Middle-earth hung by a thread. In the depths of the forest, the elves of Lothlorien continued to live as they had for ages, but beneath the surface, a quiet fear remained. They trusted their lady, but they could not shake the sense that the peace they cherished was slipping away. And Galadriel, alone in her high chamber, knew that the day would come when her choice would be final, either to wield the power she had long resisted, or to let it pass, and with it the world she had fought so hard to protect. Story 19. The Siege of Minas Ithil. Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Rising Moon, stood as a radiant beacon on the eastern frontier of Gondor, guarding the passage between the lands of men and the growing shadow of Mordor. Its gleaming white walls reflected the light of the moon, a symbol of hope and vigilance for those who defended the western lands. But as the Third Age wore on and Sauron's power rose once more in the east, Minas Ithil found itself under siege, caught in the crosshairs of a relentless assault that would determine the fate of Gondor's borders. The Dark Lord sought to reclaim what was once his, and if Minas Ithil fell, the gateway to the western lands would be open. The attack began under the cover of night. Scouts had reported movement in the mountains to the east, but the full scale of Sauron's forces only became clear when they emerged from the shadows in countless numbers, an army of orcs, trolls and darker creatures, bred for war and destruction. The ground trembled as they marched toward the city, the thud of war drums echoing through the valleys like the heartbeat of some monstrous beast. Minas Ithil's defenders watched from the walls, their hearts heavy with dread as the enemy approached. The full might of Mordor was upon them. Isildur's line still ruled Gondor at this time, and it was his younger son, Anarion, who had been given command of Minas Ithil. He was a brave and resolute leader, well loved by his people, but even he knew the odds were against them. The forces of Sauron had swelled beyond anything Gondor had seen in centuries, and Minas Ithil's garrison, though skilled and well-trained, was vastly outnumbered. Still Anarion stood firm, his silver armor gleaming in the pale light of the moon as he rallied his captains in the citadel. "The Dark Lord believes this city will fall easily," Anarion said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "He thinks that by sheer numbers he can break us, but we have something his creatures do not resolve, and the knowledge that if we fall, Gondor falls with us. We must hold this city, or the western lands will be lost." His words stirred the hearts of those who listened. The defenders knew the stakes, and though fear clung to them, they would not abandon their posts. They had trained for this moment, and Minas Ithil had long been the bulwark against Mordor's aggression. They would fight with everything they had, even if it meant their lives. As the enemy army drew closer, the city's archers took their positions along the walls, their bows at the ready. In the silence before the storm, only the sound of the wind whistling through the valley could be heard. Then, with a sudden cry, the first wave of orcs surged forward, and the battle began. Flaming arrows streaked through the night, lighting up the darkness as they rained down upon the orcs. Siege engines, crude but deadly, hurled great stones at the walls, shaking the very foundation of the city. The clash of steel rang out as Gondor's soldiers met the enemy at the gates, holding the line against the initial assault. But for every orc that fell, another took its place. The sheer numbers of Sauron's army were overwhelming, and it soon became clear that this was no ordinary siege. Sauron had come to take the city by force, and he would not stop until Minas Ithil was his. Anarion fought alongside his men, his sword flashing in the dim light as he cut down orc after orc. His captains fought bravely beside him, but the pressure was relentless. The walls, though strong, began to show signs of strain, and cracks appeared where the siege engines had struck repeatedly. The main gate, reinforced with iron and stone, groaned under the assault of the battering ram wielded by trolls, their monstrous strength pushing it closer to collapse with each strike. In the heart of the city, fear spread among the civilians. Families huddled together in the lower halls of the citadel, praying that the walls would hold. The white tree of Minas Ithil, a symbol of hope and endurance, stood tall in the courtyard, its silver leaves trembling in the night breeze. But even the light of the tree seemed to dim as the shadow of Mordor loomed closer. As dawn approached, the battle raged on with no sign of victory for either side. Anarion, bloodied but unbowed, knew that they could not withstand the siege forever. Supplies were running low, and the men were exhausted, yet he refused to give in to despair. There was still a chance, however slim, that they could turn the tide. That chance came when word reached him of a hidden tunnel beneath the city, an old passage leading out of the mountains and into the valley. It had been sealed for centuries, a remnant of an older time, when the kings of Numenor had built secret ways into their fortresses. Anarion had known of it, but until now he had not considered using it. But with the situation growing desperate, he realized it could be their only hope. He gathered a small group of his most trusted soldiers and ordered them to take the tunnel, slipping behind enemy lines to sabotage the siege engines and create chaos in the orc ranks. It was a dangerous plan, but if they could succeed, it might buy Minas Ithil the time it needed to hold out until reinforcements could arrive. Under the cover of darkness, the small group slipped into the tunnel and emerged on the far side of the valley, behind the enemy army. Moving swiftly and silently, they began their sabotage, cutting the ropes of the catapults, setting fire to the orc encampments, and sowing confusion among the ranks. The orcs, caught off guard by the sudden assault from within their own lines, faltered, giving the defenders of Minas Ithil a brief reprieve. But the relief was short-lived. As the fires spread through the enemy camp, a new terror emerged. From the heart of the enemy army, a dark figure appeared, one of Sauron's Nazgûl, its black cloak billowing as it rode forward on a massive, winged beast. The very sight of the Nazgûl struck fear into the hearts of the men of Minas Ithil, and the orcs, emboldened by the presence of their dark commander, surged forward once more with renewed fury. Anarion faced the Nazgûl on the walls, his heart racing but his resolve unshaken. He had faced many foes in his life, but none as terrifying as this. The creature's presence seemed to drain the very light from the air, and even the strongest of warriors felt their courage wane in its shadow. But Anarion stood firm, knowing that the fate of Minas Ithil rested on his shoulders. As the Nazgûl descended upon the city, Anarion and his men fought with everything they had. The battle reached its climax as the main gate, weakened by the relentless pounding of the trolls, finally gave way. The enemy poured into the city, and the streets of Minas Ithil became a brutal battleground. Anarion led the defense from the citadel, rallying his forces, even as the enemy breached the inner defenses. But as dawn broke and the light of the sun touched the land, a horn sounded in the distance. Reinforcements had come. The forces of Gondor, led by Anarion's brother Isildur, had arrived at last. With the arrival of Isildur's army, the tide of battle began to turn. The orcs, caught between the defenders of Minas Ithil and the newly arrived forces, faltered. The Nazgûl, seeing that the battle was lost, withdrew, leaving the field to Gondor's victorious forces. Minas Ithil had held, barely, but the cost had been high, and though the city remained in the hands of Gondor, the shadow of Mordor loomed ever closer, its darkness a constant threat. Anarion stood on the walls, watching the retreating enemy, knowing that this victory was but a brief respite. The war was far from over, and the fate of the western lands still hung in the balance. Story 20. The Fall of the Easterlings. For years the Easterlings had been a terror to the free peoples of Middle-earth, their fierce war bands raiding the borders of Gondor and the lands of Rhovanion. They were a proud and ruthless people, hardened by the harsh climates of the East and driven by a deep thirst for conquest. Their warlords, many of whom had made dark pacts with Sauron, commanded vast armies, and their allegiance to the Dark Lord brought them wealth, power, and a promise of dominion over the lands of men. Among these warlords, none was more feared or respected than Harazan, the Iron Wolf of Run. Harazan had risen to power through sheer strength and cunning, leading his people in countless campaigns against their enemies. He had been one of the first to bend the knee to Sauron, lured by the promise of greater power and the opportunity to carve out his own empire in the west. Under Sauron's banner, Harazan's forces had grown, and he had crushed those who stood in his way with an iron fist. But as the shadow of Mordor spread across Middle-earth, and the battles against Gondor dragged on, Harazan began to question the price of his loyalty. At first, the rewards of his alliance with Sauron had been plentiful. The Dark Lord had given him gold, weapons, and armies of orcs to bolster his own forces. But as time passed, the true nature of the pact became clear. Harazan's victories were not his own, they were Sauron's. His conquest served not to expand his own dominion, but to further Sauron's plans for Middle-earth. The men of Harazan's tribe had begun to speak in whispers, wondering whether they fought for their warlord or for a distant master who cared nothing for their people. One evening, after a particularly brutal raid against the settlements of Gondor, Harazan stood alone in his tent, gazing out across the plains of Run. His army was encamped around him, their fires burning low as they rested after days of hard fighting. The spoils of war were piled high: gold, weapons, and captives, but Harazan felt no joy in his victory. His heart was troubled. "The Dark Lord grows stronger," Harazan muttered to himself, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "But what of me? What do I gain from this endless war?" His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of one of his most trusted captains, a grizzled warrior named Gurak, who had fought by Harazan's side for many years. Gurak entered the tent, his face grim. "My lord," he said quietly, "there are rumors among the men. They say that Sauron's grip tightens with each battle. Some wonder if we are still free, or if we have become slaves to Mordor." Harazan frowned, though the words did not surprise him. He had heard the same doubts in his own mind. "And what do you think, Gurak? Are we still free?" Gurak hesitated before answering. "I think we have bound ourselves to a master who cares little for our fate. We fight, we bleed, but in the end, it is Sauron who profits from our victories. The men are loyal to you, my lord, but they fear what will happen if we continue down this path." Harazan's hand tightened on his sword. He knew Gurak was right, but to admit it was to acknowledge a truth he had been avoiding for too long. He had seen what happened to those who defied Sauron warlords who had dared to break their oaths, only to be crushed by the full weight of the Dark Lord's wrath. Harazan had no illusions about the consequences of rebellion. Breaking free from Sauron would be no easy task, and the cost could be his life and the lives of his people. "We cannot simply turn away," Harazan said at last, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "Sauron will not let us go without punishment." Gurak nodded grimly. "Then what will you do?" Harazan's mind raced. He had built his power on Sauron's promises, but he could no longer ignore the growing fear in his heart. He knew that if he remained in Sauron's service, his people would be consumed by the endless war, their lives spent in the pursuit of a dark vision that was not their own. Yet to defy Sauron would be to invite destruction. That night, Harazan called a secret council of his most loyal captains. They gathered in his tent, their faces lined with concern as they listened to their warlord speak. "We have served Sauron for many years," Harazan began, his voice low but resolute. "We have fought his battles, won his victories, but I no longer believe that this alliance will lead to the future we desire. Sauron's power grows, but it does not strengthen us, it weakens us. We have become tools in his hands, and I fear that once our usefulness is at an end, he will discard us as easily as any of his other servants." The captains exchanged uneasy glances. They had all benefited from their alliance with Mordor, but they too had seen the signs. Sauron's control over their forces had tightened with each passing year, and the cost of their victories had grown ever steeper. "What would you have us do, my lord?" one of the captains asked. "We cannot stand against Sauron. His wrath would destroy us." Harazan met their gazes, his eyes hard with determination. "We cannot stand against him, but we can find another way. I will send word to Gondor. We must find common ground with our enemies, for they are also fighting against the Shadow of Mordor. If we do not act now, we will be consumed by the very power we once sought to use for our own gain." The room fell into a heavy silence. The idea of allying with Gondor, their ancient enemy, was unthinkable to many of the Easterlings, but the desperation in Harazan's voice was clear. He knew the stakes, and he was willing to risk everything to break free from Sauron's grasp. The following days were filled with tension and uncertainty. Harazan sent emissaries in secret to the leaders of Gondor, hoping to negotiate a fragile truce. He knew it was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only path left to him. He could no longer stomach the thought of his people fighting and dying for Sauron's ambitions. But Sauron was not blind to Harazan's doubts. The Dark Lord had eyes and ears everywhere, and whispers of rebellion had reached his fortress in Barad-dûr. One evening, as the sun set over the plains of Run, a shadow passed over Harazan's camp. The air grew cold, and the ground trembled as a figure cloaked in darkness emerged from the horizon, one of the Nazgûl, Sauron's most feared servants. The Black Rider approached the camp, his presence filling the hearts of the Easterlings with terror. Harazan stood before him, his hand on the hilt of his sword, but even he felt the chill of death in the air. "You have strayed from the path, Harazan," the Nazgûl hissed, his voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "The Dark Lord knows of your treachery. You will not live to see your rebellion succeed." Harazan's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood tall. "I will no longer serve a master who uses my people as fodder for his war." The Nazgûl laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Then you will die." The battle that followed was swift and brutal. Harazan and his men fought valiantly, but the Nazgûl's power was overwhelming. One by one, the captains of the Easterlings fell, their courage no match for the dark sorcery of Sauron's servant. Harazan, the Iron Wolf of Run, met his end on the field, his body broken but his spirit unbowed. In the end, his rebellion failed, crushed beneath the weight of Sauron's might, but his defiance was not in vain. His death sowed the seeds of doubt among the Easterlings, and in the years to come many would remember Harazan's choice, the warlord who dared to stand against the Dark Lord, and who fell in the name of freedom for his people. Story 21. The Curse of the Nine Rings. In the ancient days of Numenor's glory, when the men of the West were at the height of their power, a lord named Artarazor ruled a vast estate on the island. He was a proud man, descended from a noble line, and his wealth and influence stretched across the lands. Yet, for all his power, Artarazor was not satisfied. He coveted immortality, the one gift denied to all men, even the greatest of Numenor. His ambition was known to all, and it was whispered that he would do anything to escape the doom of men-death. It was this desire that drew the attention of Sauron, the Dark Lord of Mordor. Sauron, disguised as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, had long sought to corrupt the hearts of men through the rings of power. The elves had resisted him, but the greed and ambition of men were easier to manipulate. To the most powerful of Numenor's lords he offered the Nine Rings, gifts of great power that promised wealth, dominion, and even eternal life. Artarazor, with his unquenchable thirst for immortality, was an ideal target. When Anatar arrived at the court of Numenor, he was greeted with awe and reverence. His beauty was unmatched, and his words were honeyed with wisdom and charm. He spoke of power beyond comprehension, of the ability to transcend the limits of mortality, and then, as if offering a precious treasure, he presented the Nine Rings. Artarazor was captivated, his gaze fixed on the golden band held out before him. The ring shimmered in the light, as though it pulsed with life. Anatar's voice echoed in his ears. "With this ring," Anatar said softly, "you will have the power to rule as a king among kings. Time itself will bend to your will. No more will the shadow of death haunt your steps. Immortality will be yours." The words were like a spell, and Artarazor, driven by his hunger for eternal life, accepted the ring without hesitation. As he slipped the band onto his finger, he felt a surge of energy course through his veins. It was intoxicating, a heady rush of power that made him feel invincible. Anatar smiled, though there was something cold and hollow in his eyes. The Dark Lord had planted his seed, and now it would grow. At first the ring brought only wonders. Artarazor's strength seemed to increase tenfold, his senses sharpened, and his will grew ironclad. His wealth multiplied, and those who once opposed him now bent the knee without question. It was as though the ring amplified everything within him, his ambition, his desires, his need for control. He felt as if he were becoming something greater, something more than human. But as the years passed, strange things began to happen. Artarazor's once vibrant body did not age, yet he found no joy in his immortality. A coldness began to seep into his bones, and the pleasures that once filled him with life now felt hollow. Food lost its taste, and the warmth of the sun no longer brought comfort. He became withdrawn, avoiding his family and his court, retreating into the vast halls of his fortress, where he spent hours alone, staring at the ring that had once promised him everything. At night his dreams were plagued by shadows. He would see himself walking through endless corridors of darkness, his footsteps echoing in the void. Strange voices whispered in his ear, calling him deeper into the blackness, urging him to surrender to the power of the ring. Each night the dreams grew more vivid, more terrifying. until he could no longer distinguish them from reality. He began to hear the whispers even when he was awake, a constant, insistent murmur that gnawed at his mind. In his growing madness, Tarazor became paranoid, convinced that his enemies were plotting against him. He accused his most trusted advisors of treachery and had them executed without trial. His once grand estate became a place of fear and shadow, where no laughter was heard, and his subjects spoke only in hushed tones. His family, once the center of his life, became strangers to him. He no longer recognized their faces, seeing only hollow eyes and twisted smiles. The ring had become his sole companion, the one thing he trusted in an increasingly chaotic world. One evening, after another sleepless night, filled with dark visions, Tarazor looked into the mirror and saw a face that was not his own. His skin had grown pale and stretched thin over his bones, his eyes sunken and empty. He felt no warmth, no heartbeat, only the cold presence of the ring, pulsing like a second heart in his chest. Panic seized him, and for the first time he tried to remove the ring. But the ring would not come off. He pulled at it, twisting and tugging, but it had become as much a part of him as his own flesh. His breath came in ragged gasps, and the voices in his mind grew louder, mocking his fear. He could feel the presence of something darker, something far more powerful than himself, waiting in the shadows. In a moment of pure terror, he realized the truth. The ring had not granted him immortality. It had claimed him. As the years turned into decades, Tarazor faded from the world of men. His people no longer spoke his name, and his estate fell into ruin. He wandered the halls of his fortress, a shadow of his former self, neither alive nor dead. His mind, once sharp and ambitious, had become a hollow echo, consumed by the will of the ring. And then, one night, the whispers stopped. In their place, a new voice emerged, deep and commanding, a voice that filled him with dread. It was Sauron, the true master of the rings, who now called to him across the void. The Dark Lord's voice was unmistakable, and Tarazor knew that he could no longer resist. His soul had been bound to Sauron's will from the moment he had accepted the ring, and now the time had come to serve. He was no longer Tarazor, Lord of Numenor. He was a wraith, a servant of the Dark Lord, doomed to walk the world in shadow, bound to the One Ring for all eternity. His body faded into mist, his face lost to time, and his spirit became one of the Nine, one of the Nazgul, the ring wraiths who would haunt Middle-earth until the end of days. The ring had given him what he had sought, eternity, but it was not the immortality of the blessed. It was a curse, a fate worse than death. Tarazor had fallen not to age or battle, but to his own ambition, and in the darkness of Mordor he would serve forever, a silent, unseen force, a slave to the power he had once believed would set him free. Story 22. The Doom of Amon Lanc. Once the hill of Amon Lanc in the heart of Greenwood the Great was a place of peace and beauty. The elves had lived there for generations, their homes nestled among the ancient trees, their songs filling the air like the wind through the leaves. The forest, vast and filled with life, had long been a sanctuary for all creatures, but the peace of Greenwood was not to last. A shadow began to creep from the south, darkening the forest and tainting the land. It was whispered among the elves that a great evil had returned to Middle-earth, and that the shadow upon their beloved forest was none other than Sauron, the Dark Lord. He had chosen Amon Lank as his new stronghold, and from there his corruption began to spread, slowly poisoning the once great Greenwood. The elves of Greenwood, led by their king, Thranduil, knew they could not stand idly by as their home was consumed by darkness. A group of brave warriors and scouts was assembled, their mission simple yet perilous, to investigate the growing shadow over Amon Lank and, if possible, to drive out whatever evil had taken root there. Among them was an experienced elf named Leren, a captain who had fought in many battles during the Second Age, including the War of the Last Alliance. He knew the dangers of Sauron's power all too well, but he also knew that if they did not act, Greenwood would be lost. As the small group ventured deeper into the forest, the signs of corruption became more apparent. The trees, once tall and vibrant, now stood twisted and blackened, their bark peeling away like dead skin. The air grew heavy, thick with the stench of decay, and a malevolent presence that pressed down on the elves like a physical weight. Leren could feel the shadow growing stronger the closer they came to Amon Lank. It was as if the very land had turned against them. "Something dark stirs here," Leren muttered to himself as he and his companions crept silently through the underbrush. "We must be swift, or there will be nothing left of Greenwood to save." They reached the foot of Amon Lank under the cover of night, though the darkness in the sky seemed unnatural, thicker than any normal nightfall. The hill that had once been a place of refuge for the elves was now cloaked in an oppressive shadow. At its summit, the ruins of an ancient fortress could be seen, but even those ruins had been transformed. Dark magic pulsed from the stones, and Leren knew at once that this was no ordinary stronghold. It was a place of power, and Sauron's influence had seeped into every corner of it. "We cannot go any further," said one of the younger scouts, his voice trembling. "The shadow here, it feels alive." Leren understood their fear, but retreat was not an option. If they turned back now, the shadow would only continue to spread, and soon all of Greenwood would fall. "We press on," he said firmly, his voice a steady beacon amidst the fear. "We cannot allow this evil to take root. We must discover its source." With great caution, they made their way up the hill, moving from cover to cover. Avoiding the few sentries, they saw dark figures that appeared to be neither fully alive nor dead. These wraith-like creatures were not the orcs the elves had expected, but something far worse, servants of Sauron's will, corrupted and twisted by dark sorcery. At the summit of Amon Lank, the group reached the entrance to the fortress. The doors, once magnificent and adorned with carvings of trees and elvish lore, now hung crooked and decayed. They pushed through, entering the dark halls beyond. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with the smell of rot, and something else, something darker, more sinister. Leren could feel it in his bones. This was no mere fortress. This was a place of evil, a place where Sauron's power was growing, unchecked. As they ventured deeper into the fortress, the shadows seemed to close in around them. Leren's heart pounded in his chest, and though he had faced many foes in his long life, he had never felt fear like this. It was as though the very air was filled with whispers, voices that called out to him, promising power, immortality, if only he would surrender to the darkness. But Laren resisted. He gripped the hilt of his sword tightly, focusing on the mission. They had come to find Sauron, or whatever lieutenant of his had claimed Amon Lank, but what they found was worse than they had imagined. In the heart of the fortress they came upon a great chamber, its walls lined with dark, writhing forms. At the center of the room, seated on a throne of black stone, was a figure cloaked in shadow. Though Laren could not see its face, he could feel the immense power radiating from it. It was Sauron, he had no doubt. The Dark Lord had taken residence in Amon Lank, and from here he would spread his corruption throughout the land. Laren motioned for his companions to hold back as he stepped forward, his heart racing. They were not equipped to face Sauron directly, but if they could strike quickly, perhaps they could disrupt his plans, slow his spread before all of Greenwood was lost. But before Laren could move, the figure on the throne stirred. A voice, cold and venomous, filled the chamber. "You think to challenge me, elf?" Sauron's voice was a whisper and a roar all at once. "I have seen your kind fall before, and you will fall again." The darkness in the room seemed to come alive, swirling around Laren and his companions. The elves drew their weapons, but it was already too late. Sauron's power was too great, and they were but a handful of warriors standing against the might of a Dark Lord. In a single moment, the chamber erupted into chaos. Shadows lashed out like whips, striking down the elves one by one. Laren fought with all his strength, but it was a losing battle. His companions fell around him, their cries of pain swallowed by the darkness. He felt the weight of Sauron's gaze upon him, and in that moment he knew they had failed. The shadow enveloped Laren, dragging him to his knees. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the figure on the throne, rising, its eyes burning with malice. Amon Lank was lost, and with it, the hope of stopping Sauron's return. The survivors of the mission fled back to Thranduil's halls, but the shadow over Greenwood continued to spread. In time, Amon Lank would be known as Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery, and Greenwood the Great would become Mirkwood, a dark and twisted reflection of its former self. Sauron's hold on the forest was complete, and the elves of Greenwood could do nothing but watch as their home fell under the shadow of the Dark Lord. The doom of Amon Lank was sealed, and the corruption of Greenwood had begun. Story 23. The Shipbuilders of Numenor. In the final years of Numenor's glory, the island nation stood at the pinnacle of its power. Its cities gleamed with white stone, its people were wise and strong, and its fleets dominated the seas. But beneath the surface of this greatness, darkness had begun to spread. Ar-Pharazôn, the last king of Numenor, had fallen under the sway of Sauron, the Dark Lord, who now walked freely in the halls of Armenaeus, his words like poison in the ears of the mighty. Sauron's influence had turned the once noble people of Numenor toward ambition, conquest, and a desire for immortality. And it was this same dark ambition that led Ar-Pharazôn to command the building of a great fleet, one that would carry his armies to the Undine lands, to challenge the very Vala themselves. The task of constructing this fleet fell to the master shipbuilders of Numenor, men whose skills were unrivaled, whose ships were the envy of the world. Among them was Amandil, a shipwright of great renown and a man who had once been a close friend to the king. But as Sauron's grip tightened around the throne, Amandil had withdrawn from the court, choosing instead to focus on his craft. He was a man of deep loyalty to Numenor's ancient traditions, and he grieved to see how far his people had strayed from the wisdom of the Eldar and the Valar. When the decree came from Ar-Pharazôn, demanding the construction of a fleet vast enough to challenge the gods, Amandel knew that this could only lead to disaster. The very idea of sailing against the Valar, of invading Aman, was a blasphemy beyond comprehension. He also knew that Sauron had twisted the king's heart, and that this fleet would not bring glory to Numenor, but rather its ruin. Amandel gathered the other master shipbuilders in secret, meeting in the shadowed halls of their great shipyards. These men, like Amandel, had built their lives around the sea, their hands skilled in the crafting of ships that had carried Numenor's pride across the oceans. They had seen the greatness of their nation, but they had also watched as Sauron's influence began to corrupt everything they held dear. "We are being asked to build the instruments of our own destruction," Amandel said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "This fleet is not meant to conquer new lands or expand Numenor's reach. It is meant to defy the Valar, and if we build these ships we will be condemning our island to doom." The others nodded grimly. They had all heard the rumors whispers of a dark power growing in Armanelos, of sacrifices made in secret to Morgoth, the Dark Master whom Sauron had once served. The people of Numenor had turned away from the Valar, and now they followed the king blindly toward destruction. "What do you propose, Amandel?" asked one of the shipbuilders, a man named Erelus. "We are bound by the king's command. If we refuse, we will be branded traitors." Amandel's eyes darkened, but his resolve was clear. "We cannot refuse outright. The king's will is law. But we can act in secret. We can sabotage the fleet. Build the ships, yes, but weaken them. Ensure that they will not survive the journey across the seas. If we do this carefully, Sauron will not know until it is too late." There was a tense silence as the shipbuilders considered his words. To defy the king, even in secret, was a dangerous act. But Amandel's plan offered a glimmer of hope, a chance to save Numenor from the madness that had overtaken it. Slowly, the shipbuilders began to agree, one by one, until all were united in their resolve. For the next year they worked in the great shipyards of Numenor, crafting the fleet that would one day be called the Armada of the Great King. To the casual observer, the work proceeded as it always had, with the shipbuilders laboring tirelessly to create vessels of unmatched beauty and power. But beneath the surface, subtle acts of sabotage were being carried out. The beams of the ships were not fitted as tightly as they should have been, the sails woven with threads that would fray under strain, and the keels weakened in places where the eyes of Sauron's overseers would not see. The shipbuilders worked in constant fear of discovery. Sauron had agents everywhere, and his gaze was ever watchful. But Amandel and his men were careful, knowing that any mistake could cost them their lives and the lives of their families. They spoke little of their work, even among themselves, and each night they left the shipyards with the weight of their secret heavy on their shoulders. As the fleet neared completion, the mood in Numenor darkened. The skies above the island grew thick with storm clouds, and strange omens were seen in the stars. The people whispered of the Valar's wrath, though many had grown too proud or too fearful to heed the warnings. In the halls of the king, Sauron's voice grew louder, urging Ar-Pharazôn to make his move to launch the fleet and claim the immortality he had been promised. Amandil knew the time was running out. The ships were nearly ready, and soon they would be launched. He could only hope that the sabotage would hold, that when the fleet sailed into the west, it would fail before reaching the shores of Ammon. But then, on the eve of the fleet's departure, disaster struck. One of Amandil's men, a young shipwright named Elenian, was caught tampering with the hull of one of the king's ships. He was brought before Sauron himself, and though he tried to remain silent, Sauron's power was too great. Under torture, Elenian revealed the full extent of the sabotage. The next day, the shipyards were in chaos. Sauron's soldiers swept through the yards, arresting anyone suspected of being part of the conspiracy. Amandil and the other master shipbuilders were among them, dragged from their homes and taken to the dungeons beneath Ar-Menelaus. There they were brought before Ar-Pharazôn, who demanded to know why they had defied him. "We sought only to save Númenor," Amandil said, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. "Sauron has led you down a path of madness. If you sail west, you will bring ruin to our people." But the king's heart was hard, and Sauron's influence too great. Ar-Pharazôn condemned Amandil and his men to death, their names erased from the records of Númenor, their sacrifice forgotten by all but a few. As they were led to their fate, Amandil could only pray that their actions had been enough, that the ships they had weakened would fail before it was too late. In the end, the fleet did sail, and though the ships reached the shores of Ammon, it was not the Valar's wrath that destroyed them, but the folly of Ar-Pharazôn himself. The fleet was swept away by a great wave, and Númenor was consumed by the sea. The island was lost, and with it, the greatest kingdom of men was reduced to legend. But the shipbuilders, those who had tried to save their land from its doom, were remembered in secret by those who survived, by the faithful who fled to Middle-earth. Their story was whispered among the Dúnedain, a tale of defiance and sacrifice, of those who had stood against the shadow, even when all hope seemed lost. Story 24. The Secret of the Palantiri. In the twilight years of Gondor's fading power, stories of ancient relics long lost began to stir once more. Among these tales was the legend of the Palantiri, the seeing stones, said to have been crafted by the elves of Aman and gifted to the Dúnedain of Númenor. 7 of these stones were brought to Middle-earth, and through them the kings of old could see across vast distances, communicate with each other, and peer into the hidden depths of the world. But as Gondor's might waned and the shadow of Mordor spread, many of the Palantiri were lost, forgotten, or abandoned. Only a few remained, and the knowledge of how to use them had become shrouded in mystery. It was during this uncertain time that Ilarion, a young scholar and descendant of a noble Gondorian family, made a discovery that would change his life and perhaps the fate of Middle-earth. Ilarion was a man of great curiosity, always seeking to uncover the lost lore of his ancestors. He spent long hours in the forgotten libraries of Minas Tirith, poring over ancient scrolls and records, searching for remnants of Gondor's past glory. It was in one such dusty archive that he stumbled upon a fragment of a map, old and crumbling, but unmistakably leading to a hidden chamber deep beneath the city. The map led him to a place long sealed, a vault that had once been the private storehouse of one of Gondor's former kings. Within, Illyrian found a treasure of immeasurable value, a palantir, one of the lost-seeing stones, resting on a pedestal of black marble, its smooth surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. Illyrian's heart raced. He had read the legends of the Palantiri, knew of their power, but to see one before him was beyond his wildest dreams. For a long moment he hesitated. The Palantiri were dangerous, he knew that much. They could reveal great truths, but they also held the potential to bring ruin. He had heard whispers of how the Palantir of Orthanc had fallen into the hands of Saruman, who had become ensnared by its power and Sauron's influence. Still, the temptation to use it was overwhelming. What secrets could it reveal? What truths about Gondor's future might he uncover? Unable to resist, Illyrian reached out and placed his hand on the stone's cool surface. Instantly, a rush of sensation overwhelmed him. His vision blurred, and for a moment, it felt as if his mind had been pulled across time and space, spinning through endless shadows and flickers of light. And then, suddenly, his sight cleared. At first, the visions were beautiful scenes of Gondor in its prime, its armies strong and its kings wise, the land bathed in light. He saw the white tree of Minas Tirith in full bloom, the fields of Pelennor stretching far and wide, and the walls of the city gleaming like silver under the sun. But then the visions changed. Darkness crept into the edges of his sight, and Illyrian began to see scenes of horror, Gondor's walls crumbling under siege, its people fleeing before a wave of shadow, and the eye of Sauron, burning red and fierce, gazing directly into his soul. The terror of the vision gripped him, and he tried to pull away from the stone, but his mind was trapped. He saw a future where the armies of Mordor marched upon Minas Tirith, where Gondor's defenders were overwhelmed, and where the once great city was reduced to ruin. The eye of Sauron loomed larger, filling his vision, and for a terrible moment, Illyrian feared that the Dark Lord himself had seen him. With a gasp, he tore his hand from the Palantir and stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gulps. His heart pounded in his chest, and cold sweat dripped down his back. For several moments he stood frozen, his mind reeling from what he had seen. The visions had been so vivid, so real, but were they true? Had he seen the future, or had the stone shown him only what he feared most? Illyrian knew the danger of the Palantiri. The ancient texts warned that those who used the stones risked attracting the gaze of Sauron, for the Dark Lord had access to at least one of the stones, and through it he could manipulate and control those who dared to peer into the seeing stones. Illyrian had been fortunate to break free of the vision when he had, but he feared that Sauron had sensed him, that the eye had glimpsed his presence. The days that followed were filled with anxiety. Illyrian could not shake the feeling that something dark now watched him, lurking at the edge of his consciousness. His dreams were filled with shadows, with the distant sound of marching armies, and the ever-present weight of Sauron's gaze. The knowledge he had gained from the Palantir gnawed at him. Was Gondor truly doomed to fall? Were the visions inevitable, or was there still a way to avert the disaster he had seen? Despite his fear, Illyrian returned to the Palantir. He told himself that he needed answers, that the fate of Gondor was too important to ignore. If there was a way to change the course of events, to save the city from the doom he had seen, it lay within the stone. But each time he used the Palantir, the visions grew darker, more twisted. He saw the armies of Mordor massing at the gates of Minas Tirith, the Nazgûl sweeping down upon the city, and the people of Gondor scattered like leaves before the wind. And always the eye of Sauron grew closer, more oppressive, as if it were reaching out for him. The visions began to haunt his waking hours as well. Illyrian found himself unable to focus, his thoughts consumed by the dark images the stone had shown him. He became withdrawn, avoiding his friends and colleagues, fearing that they would sense the shadow that now clung to him. He felt as if the Palantir had marked him, drawing Sauron's attention ever closer. Yet, despite the terror it brought, he could not resist the stone's pull. The need to see, to know, had become an obsession. One night, as he sat alone in the vault where he had hidden the Palantir, the vision came without warning. He had not touched the stone, yet his mind was suddenly filled with the same terrible scenes: the fall of Gondor, the triumph of Sauron, and the utter destruction of all he held dear. But this time, the eye of Sauron did more than watch. It spoke. "You cannot hide from me, Illyrian," the voice whispered, cold and malevolent. "You have seen what awaits your people. Gondor will fall, and you will fall with it." Illyrian recoiled, his heart pounding in terror. The Palantir pulsed before him, its surface glowing with a dark, unnatural light. He knew then that he had been playing a dangerous game, and that Sauron had now truly found him. The visions had been more than just images of a possible future. They were a trap, meant to ensnare his mind and bring him under the Dark Lord's control. In desperation, Illyrian seized the Palantir and hurled it to the ground, shattering the stone into 1,000 pieces. The vault was filled with a burst of light, and for a moment it felt as if the air itself had been torn apart by the force of the impact. And then silence. Illyrian collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The weight of Sauron's gaze had lifted, but the darkness lingered in his mind. He had destroyed the Palantir, but the visions remained burned into his soul. He had glimpsed the future, and though he had escaped the stone's influence, he could not escape the fear that Gondor's doom was sealed. In the days that followed, Illyrian left Minas Tirith, his mind too shaken to continue his work. He had learned the terrible secret of the Palantiri, that they showed not just what was, but what could be, and that those who looked into their depths risked far more than just knowledge. They risked their very souls. And somewhere in the dark lands of Mordor, the eye of Sauron watched, waiting for the day when the doom of Gondor would come to pass.